The story kicks off with a man shouting orders, telling everyone to pack up fast. Soon they'll be heading straight home. Nearby, a young guy downs a drink and casually says he's already on his way out. When asked if he's staying for dinner, he politely declines. He's got plans for tomorrow. His coworker jokes, saying he just wanted to know what the guy eats, since he's the only one who never looks exhausted after a shift. The truth? The guy's secret is simple: vitamins. He takes them religiously every morning and wonders if anyone else realizes just how powerful they are. This is Park Han-yul, 22 years old, and ever since his military days, he's known that his body reacts differently to drugs. It all started when he tried out some supplements his bunkmate gave him. After a brutal day of training, just 2 pills wiped out his fatigue, and a dose of omega-3 cleared his head like magic. Later on, we see him getting off a bus, thinking about grabbing a coffee on his way back home, but suddenly he notices someone staring at him. It's a girl. She looks desperate, and she walks up saying this is the first time she's ever told this to someone. Park Han-yul freezes, thinking she's about to confess her love. Excited, he asks how he can help, but surprise, it's a trap. She tries to recruit him into some sketchy cult. As she walks away, she insists she's not a bad person and introduces herself as Han Yuni. A little stunned, he jogs off, wishing her a good day while silently cursing the world of cults and fake saints. It's a sore spot for him because of his father. But one day, he claimed to have made a life-changing decision: to create a miracle drug that would turn him into a saint. He quit his job, moved to the countryside, and started downing bizarre concoctions. He ended up hospitalized more times than anyone could count. Eventually, desperate for answers, his father wandered off into the wilderness, saying he'd return with divine energy. That was 20 years ago. Park Han-yul was only 2 years old. Now, while buying more of his beloved vitamins, he reflects on the past. His mom endured so much after his father vanished. And honestly, maybe if his dad had just stuck with supplements like him, he'd still be around. But just as Han-yul leaves the store, he feels a strange energy, and then sees it. A massive glowing circle appears in the sky. No one around him knows what to make of it. And while everyone stares in confusion, Park Han-yul thinks back. When he walked in, that thing wasn't there. It's not street art, and it sure doesn't look like a drone. Maybe it's a spaceship? Whatever it is, something's about to happen. Suddenly, the ground begins to shake. People around start to scream and run in panic, but Park stays surprisingly calm, scanning the chaos around him. Then, as the earth cracks open right in front of him, a monstrous hand emerges from the gap. Slowly, a terrifying creature pulls itself up from the abyss. It's some kind of demon. The creature now towering over him, Park realizes it's coming straight at him. His instincts scream for him to run. That's when something inside him shifts. His heart pounds harder, faster, and suddenly, a strange message pops up, activating nutrient reserves. Even the demon seems to hear the voice. Just before it rings out again, energy supplied, enhancing physical functions. In the blink of an eye, Park's senses sharpen. Time feels slower. The monster lunges, but to Park, the attack is sluggish. He easily dodges, stunned by how fast his body is reacting. Confused but amazed, he wonders if this power had always been inside him. Was it because of the supplements? Either way, now he knew. He could run, he could escape, but then he looks around and sees others not so lucky. People are being ripped apart by demons, right there in the streets. Rage wells up inside him. If he had this power, maybe he could fight back. Without hesitation, he charges forward. In one swift move, he kicks the demon so hard it's launched off the ground. Both him and the demon scramble for a nearby club, but Park gets to it first. Without a second thought, he slams it down on the creature's head. Turns out it wasn't even that tough, but there's no time to celebrate. More demons rush him, but now, Park is in the zone. He takes them down one after another, his body moving with precision and power. In seconds, the street is filled with demon corpses. Breathing heavily, he looks up, only to freeze. Standing before him is a giant demon, far larger than any of the others, and it's staring straight at him, having just noticed all of its fallen comrades. Still fired up, Park considers the possibility. Maybe this one is weak too. Before he can act, the creature charges. In a split second, blood splashes through the air. Elsewhere in the city, the chaos continues. People are still fighting for their lives. One man nervously asks what happens if the demons reach their location. Another, just as terrified, says they need to shut the door immediately. But before they can, a body crashes into the store, slamming into both of them. They look up, and right in front of them is a towering demon. One of the guys falls to his knees, begging for his life, crying out for anyone to save him. At that very moment, somewhere else, someone takes a drag from a cigarette. The system chimes again. Elixir consumed. Without warning, the protagonist comes flying in, delivering a brutal kick that sends the demon flying through the air. His body strikes a fierce pose, adrenaline now flooding his system. Park, ready to go again, smirks. "Let's start round 2, he says, before charging in and punching the demon straight in the face. He unleashes a flurry of blows, refusing to give it any room to breathe. But the demon fights back, lunging at him. But Park dodges again with ease. "I'm still full of energy," he shouts, slamming another punch into the monster's jaw. Then, he grabs its head and smashes it into the asphalt. The demon goes down, and for a moment, Park breathes. He mutters that maybe the cigarettes are giving him some kind of buff too, and silently hopes his mother is okay. But just as he thinks it's over, the demon gets up again. It roars, grabs Park by the head, and throws him hard to the ground. He groans, barely conscious, but manages to catch the demon's fist, holding it back with sheer will. With the last of his strength, he drives a punch into its stomach. This time, the demon finally collapses. Exhausted, Park slumps to the ground, completely drained. He can't even move, but even in that state, he notices more chaos unfolding around him. The other civilians hadn't made it out. Trying to stand, he finds his body won't respond. He's out of energy. He wonders where these monsters came from and why they're attacking ordinary people. Desperation builds as he pleads silently for them to stop. Before his eyes, another demon grabs a defenseless man, and Park is forced to watch, unable to help. The horror isn't over yet, but then someone appears in midair. With a piece of paper in hand, the figure begins chanting what looks like a spell, and in an instant, several demons are wiped out. Park, stunned, watches everything unfold. Who was that? Was that even a human? A girl approaches him and compliments his performance, clearly impressed. "How did you manage to kill a demon like that without any training?" she asks, eyeing him curiously. "Who exactly are you?" Park, still in shock, doesn't even react. She steps closer, saying she needs to check something, and asks him to hold out his hand. Still confused, Park hesitates. But before he can move, some kind of spell pulls his hand toward her. She studies it, and her expression instantly shifts. Whatever she saw, it wasn't normal, not divine, not demonic, not even human. Something irregular. She can hardly believe it. A mix of sorrow and resolve flashes in her eyes. Even if it's tragic that someone like him was chosen, she can't let that kind of power run wild. She begins to cast another spell, but before she can finish, Park thanks her. Completely sincere, he says that if she hadn't shown up, he probably wouldn't be alive, and he doesn't even know how to express his gratitude. Her hands freeze. For a moment, she falls silent, watching this boy, so polite, so genuine, and thinks what a shame it is that such a kind heart and pure energy might go to waste. She makes her decision. Without saying a word, she throws a pill into his mouth. He swallows it instantly and immediately winces. "Ugh, what was that? It's so bitter," he asks, confused. She replies calmly, "It was a medicine, one that seals his energy center. It's not normally used on uncontrollable demons, but in his case, it's the only way to keep him alive. His powers, his irregularity, will eventually destroy him and everyone around him. He might suffer," she says, "but it's for the greater good." And with that, she quietly begs him not to hate her. If fate allows, maybe they'll meet again. Without even revealing her name, the girl turns and walks away, disappearing into the distance. Park collapses to the ground, dazed. He stares at the sky, trying to process everything. Why had she given him that pill? What did she mean by irregular? Was it tied to his strange attribute? He forces himself to his feet, bitterly muttering that without his powers, he'd be lying in a pool of his own blood right now. He refuses to let them be taken from him. Without wasting time, he rushes to a store. He grabs a supplement, gulps it down, and immediately the system announces, "Drug consumed." From that day forward, Park makes a decision. If these powers are his, then he'll use them to survive. Sometime later, he's back home, surrounded by a mountain of supplements. Even hangover drinks seem to boost his energy, but his mind drifts back to the girl. The word disaster still echoes in his thoughts. That pill, it had to be doing something to him. Still, there's no time to dwell. He grabs what he needs and prepares to head straight to his mother. Just then, his phone buzzes. It's a government alert. Monsters are appearing everywhere. The message urges citizens to download a new emergency app for updates and protection. He opens the app store and squints at the name, Special Precautions number 24. "Wow," he mutters. "They clearly just made this thing. The UI is terrible." Regardless, he installs it. Once downloaded, he scans his ID and the app responds, "Authentication complete." Redirecting. Suddenly, strange symbols begin flashing all around him. "What the hell?" Park mutters, trying to understand what's happening. Then the system speaks again. "Spiritual physique detected. Commencing full body analysis." Park flinches. It's just like the girl said. This must be part of whatever that irregularity is, and now it's surfacing again. again. Suddenly, pain shoots through his body. Why now? Of course, it had to be that damn medicine kicking in. He chugs another supplement to ease the pain, and almost instantly, he feels better. But the analysis isn't over. The system flashes another message. Analysis complete. Detected substance, blue void. Attribute, trees. Park just stares. Blue void? Trees? What kind of power had he been born with? The chance of obtaining water from that material was extremely rare, and its name was bluish fuel. They called it that because it worked like a condensed elixir and held the energy of the entire Earth. Meanwhile, Park was still waiting for the system's response. The energy of the blue matter was an ingredient in the medicine the protagonist had taken, and since the effects of the hangover drink cured the poisonous effect of the medicine, only the energy of the blue matter had remained in his body. Thus, something very interesting ended up happening to Park's body. The protagonist, desperate, realizes that his body was very hot, so he thought it would be better to wait for his fever to go down. However, the boy felt very restless, still wondering if there was some way to feel more comfortable. Then right after, he seems to have an idea, supposing that the best way would be meditating, mentioning that this wasn't one of the positions practiced by those people in martial arts movies. Besides, that position was very comfortable, so he will stay like that until his fever goes down. Park says he should have a regular physique, complaining about his mundane body. Then the system announces that the results show the protagonist had a mundane body full of tree energy. The boy thinks she gave him a medicine because he was considered irregular, wondering what that meant with the tree energies. Moreover, it seemed that the effects of the poison had disappeared, wondering if the effects of the ingredients changed while he was being analyzed. Even so, it was a relief as he could have been killed if the analysis showed he was irregular. However, a different colored system appears, and from it, a man emerges, greeting all the citizens of Korea, saying he wanted to mention that everything he was going to say from now on was completely true. 10,000 years ago, the world was in a much more spectacular place than it is now, because those beings we call monsters roamed the Earth, while other beings from other worlds crossed galaxies to reach Earth. At that time, humans were killed and discarded. Amidst that chaos, a few chosen ones were granted spiritual physiques, a special power they didn't possess before. This acquired power gave humans a life expectancy comparable to that of monsters. Thus, it signaled the beginning of a world where anyone could wield great powers. Then later, these people were named monks, and in order to close the gates to heaven, they ended up sacrificing their lives for a greater good, making it so that humans could thrive on Earth for eternity. These people were remembered as myths and legends, and their stories were passed down through generations. Thus, they continued protecting the gates as humanity progressed, or at least that was how it went until a few hours ago. All the chosen monks will be patrolling their designated areas to protect the safety of all humanity. And also, these people have been tested for their abilities, which gives them the right to enforce the law when necessary. Meanwhile, Park was still analyzing that system, wondering if this is what it meant by finding suitable skills for his aptitudes. At that moment, several other screens began to appear in his vision, wondering if everything around him was skills, realizing that it was indeed the case, because those are all the parts where he could feel the heat emanating. Additionally, in that image, the protagonist was in the same position. After training systematically for a certain period of time, he could emanate heat from at least one of these 3 places, and once those 3 places start to heat up, he should begin the training of the ground path. Until yesterday, he didn't believe in religion or anything like that, but now he was practicing this sacred breathing technique. Right after, the boy seems to start meditating, surprised because it was much easier than he had thought, assuming that even if he had a spiritual body, it takes time to feel the energy gathering in the 3 cores. That could take months or even years for some, as it depended more on their talent. With enough training, one can reach a state of emptiness and unconsciousness, even of one's surroundings. Thus, Park took his first step toward becoming a monk. When he opens his eyes, he ends up confused because several plants were surrounding his body, wondering what all that was and how long he had been in that position. Grabbing his phone, he realizes that its battery had died. Therefore, he should have a clock somewhere to check the time. However, when he looks, he sees that it was June 22nd, completely surprised because 100 days had passed while he was meditating. Sometime later, the boy had already taken a shower, happy because there was still water. Assuming it was very strange as his injuries were healed, and he didn't feel very hungry. Moreover, he hadn't lost much weight, Instead, he had become much stronger. Grabbing his phone, he notices it was charging, wondering if perhaps he should check the news. However, when he looked outside earlier, there was a barrier in the shape of a giant dome, wondering how there were holes with monsters coming out, and that area was probably an extreme danger zone. At that moment, he realizes that another earthquake had occurred. However, it was just a horrifying figure walking across the field. Desperate, the protagonist wonders what that was, as there were several demons surrounding those buildings, thinking he needed to get out of that place immediately. However, he realizes that there was no signal in that place, so calling for emergency help was his only option, thinking that he had put his temperature to sleep with the breathing technique and survived 100 days in the lotus position. Right after, a system appears welcoming Park, mentioning that he wasn't connected to a network and that some features require a connection. Looking at the system, the boy wonders if there was nothing in that place he could use. Additionally, the only thing that opened was his profile with his information, and also a strange thing called that had 2 available charm copies. The system announces that there were 3 usable charms, and depending on the user's nickname and ranking, higher level charms are given, and the first one was called Soft Steps, a special 9th rank magic. The boy thinks it was very easy, wondering if that was all he had to do, but still, he didn't feel any change in his body. At that moment, when he tries to take just a small step, he ends up hitting his face against the wall, saying that the special magic contracted was indeed real, wondering what the other abilities were. Then it is revealed that he had one of the abilities that would allow him to carry more weight, and the other was able to create a tornado of light. Park, surprised, wonders if perhaps he should use that on the roof. However, the problem was that the monsters could see the light and come after him. Moreover, he had copied the breathing technique last time, wondering if he should take a closer look. The system announces that the training is divided from 1 to 10 stars, and after the 5th star, he could use nature techniques. Park, in turn, is surprised, because he could also increase the levels. However, his hopes are dashed, because it would take at least 10 years to raise a star, and for that reason, he would need at least 70 years to use one of those. Nevertheless, the young man says he would check how many stars he had first. That was how he could assess himself, by placing energy into both hands and checking the energy rings on his left hand. Thus, he began channeling energy into his hands. The number of rings on his hand represented his star level. However, the boy seemed surprised by what he saw. At that very moment, a monster began charging toward him, so he needed to find something quickly to help him. In a matter of seconds, a tiger was already at his door, starting to attack the protagonist, tearing into his shoulder. In ancient China, there was a skill called the absorption method, a skill capable of stealing the vitality of a beast, and the protagonist chose something similar to that ability. Then the boy, incredibly, ended up using a 6th level art, successfully defeating that beast. Meanwhile, the green aura began to surround the boy, saying that he only survived because he found a very useful ability. But, at that same moment, he collapsed to the ground. The system announced that a muscle had formed, and his blood was stable, and the production of red blood cells had drastically increased. Then a green glow began to emanate from the protagonist's eye. Looking at his hand, Park wondered what was happening, why he could feel an enormous amount of energy flowing throughout his entire body, supposing that it was because his nutrients were replenished when he absorbed the energy from that monster. Even so, it was great, as this much should be enough to hold up after using the light tornado. Looking to the side, he noticed that some plants were sprouting from the monster's body, saying that definitely wasn't there before, and so he should pick them up as they might be useful. While walking, he realized he could only use one sprout at a time, and if he had time to absorb the energy from monsters before finishing them, he could do something much better. However, he thought it was better to avoid too many problems, as he needed to hold on until the rescue team arrived. Observing the light tornado ability, he thought he would need to use it at some point. At that moment, another monster appeared, charging toward the boy once again. As a result, he began using that ability again, landing a punch on that monster, thinking that there wasn't any time to relax, and he needed to get up quickly and call for rescue with his light tornado ability. But every time, he kept encountering monsters like that, and countless times, he simply started defeating them. But even so, it never ended and kept coming back. Sometime later, the boy ended up reaching the rooftop of that building, completely surprised by what he was seeing because a gigantic monster was standing next to him. Watching the situation, the boy thought he was going crazy, and at that moment, another monster appeared behind him. But even so, Park thought it was all or nothing, charging toward that giant monster. Then he began using that light tornado ability. Sometime later, a voice asked where the protagonist was, asking the boy to come out now. Noticing a man flying, Park sent a signal, indicating that he was down below. The man, in turn, questioned why Park was just standing there and asked if he didn't have a talisman to fly or at least jump, but the boy said he only had the 3 he had gotten earlier. The man, saying that was very boring, asked the boy to extend his hand, wondering what the boy was doing and if he couldn't hear. But the boy pointed out that there was a monster behind him. In a matter of seconds, the man seemed to use a talisman, effortlessly defeating that monster, telling him not to make him repeat himself and to extend his hand, asking who he was to be wandering around a restricted area, and if he didn't value his life. Park, about to explain what had happened, the man said it didn't matter because he didn't need to know that. So our boy thanked him for saving him. Leaving that barrier, Park thought it scared him because there were countless notifications from his mother. But he understood that as he had been trapped in that place for 100 days, and he was very happy that his mother and his relatives were fine, thinking that many things had happened during that time, wondering how different everything could be now. Sometime later, the boy was in a building, telling his mother that he wanted to call her again, mentioning that it was nothing, as he had been lost but had found his way back, and for that reason he would see her again in a few days. The other guy asked if he had finished his call, and the protagonist said yes, thinking he was relieved that his relatives and his mother seemed safe. Soon after, the man seemed to rush into the room, desperate, wondering if the protagonist was who he thought. Then the man introduced him, saying that he was one of the disciples under the command of the region unit. However, the man seemed uninterested in that, asking the other officer to leave the place, ordering him to do it, and not to make him repeat himself again. Shortly after, the man asks if he had learned Ascendance even before his heavenly gate opened. The protagonist replies that he had not. Then the man asks if he was worthy of waking his sleeping master. Park, in turn, coldly observed the situation. Then a system screen appeared in front of him, and the man asked if the boy could see it, asking if it said Ascendant, and whether there were a total of 9 high ranks. Most of the awakened ones were disciples who could be called saints, and the mundane rank was the highest. However, that man had been recognized for his qualifications, and ended up being qualified as an ascendant under his master. Age and ethnicity didn't matter, as the person who accumulated the most disciple training was the senior, and not necessarily the younger one. That's why Park had to do his best for his senior, as that was the unspoken rule. Park asks if ascendant was the lowest rank, and what rank his master was, irritating the man who asked him not to speak of what he didn't know. He mentioned that Park had been born with a spiritual physique, so if he wanted to survive in that world, he had to stay under the protection of his superiors. For that reason, there wouldn't be a second chance, and if he said that again, he would die. However, Park says he had heard that no one could change masters 3 times, so the man might have been following that master because he thought his way of speaking was very interesting. This left the man completely furious with what he had heard, but at that moment, a system screen appeared, showing all the protagonist's information, saying that he thought the man had mentioned that rank was the closest one after Ascendant. Standing up, Park says he needed to do his best for his superior. Sometime later, that man was arguing with his master, asking if he had treated his senior as he had been told, and if he was saying that he had handed over the technique he had used. Irritated, he says he was very foolish because he wanted to say he inherited the technique of a bandit and lowered his head to that man. However, the man says that his performance range was greater than his own, which is why he was a high saint. His master says that it could be due to his body's condition, but the man says that if that were the case, he certainly could have an irregular physique. This leaves the man even more annoyed, questioning if he would keep saying such foolish things, and if he was implying that the boy was born with a mundane physique like the 2 of them. The man asks if that means his training is more accelerated. However, the master didn't even know that, because even originally, it was difficult to see a human incline toward nature. Humans once came out of the water and then returned to the land. They mastered fire to fend off the cold, and melted iron to refine it. Although there are great similarities between living things, their relationships are quite incompatible. The master says that the report to help her is likely because it was an extremely rare case, and if he understood, he shouldn't mention anything about the construction method, because they would deliver a drug to be careful with when his breathing stabilizes. Observing the situation, his master thinks it is very fascinating, thinking that the star wind only exists for those inclined toward nature, wondering how he had never heard of such a thing. Meanwhile, Park was at home, working on his computer, thinking that according to the government's announcement, there wasn't a single person who had an irregular physique. In all nations, the few people who had an irregular physique in spiritual and physical tests were isolated. However, our protagonist hadn't been caught yet. The irregular physique was spiritual and broadly divided into 3 types, which were the celestial, mundane, and human physiques. However, the 4th was an unpredictable spiritual physique that could appear. Even in the past decade, when saints disappeared, the monsters still tried to interfere in the world. Therefore, to prevent them from doing harm, the saints united and banished them from that place. For that reason, their existence was nothing more than legends and tales. Furthermore, there were two examples of that, because it did make sense to think that he should be banished as he wasn't a famous serial killer. While drinking his coffee, the system informs him that the drug was consumed, saying that even in that bag of brown rice tea, it's worth trembling when you see someone obtaining its maximum effectiveness. And he thought he had gotten a mundane physique result in the spiritual physical test, and because of that, the blue matter from Brazil was given to him. While he didn't know how long the drug would last, he was trying to find something with similar effects, but there was nothing reliable. For that reason, he thought there might be a limit to the information that could be spread to the private sector. But at that moment, the boy seems to have an idea. He searches the word drugs in his search bar, finding some information similar to what he was looking for. Observing the seeds, he wonders what they were, wondering if those seeds were the ones he had seen before. While holding the seeds, Parcaniel remembers that he had obtained them when he fought with a beast, and thought they were more common than he had initially believed. Upon researching online, he sees that there were no images about the germination of those seeds. Then he makes an anonymous pose asking if anyone had seen those seeds before. Those seeds were purgatory herbs, a herb that grows naturally near the river Styx, and if eaten raw, would make a person sick. However, the conditions for germination were restrictive, making it extremely difficult to obtain germinated seeds. But the protagonist thinks that the ones he had were already germinated. So he decides to experiment with the ungerminated ones, deciding to use the solar wind breathing technique on the seeds, which in turn start growing the boy's hands. A man enters the room shouting. However, the young man was no longer there. The man wonders if he had escaped. He then searches the room to see if the protagonist had stolen anything. Opening the refrigerator, he discovers that the boy had taken one of his peaches. Elsewhere, Park continues experimenting with the seeds. Soon after, a small tree grows. Parcaniel says that he had only breathed for 2 hours, and it had already grown a lot. Admiring his accomplishment, thinking that through breathing, energy is exchanged with everything around him. As expected, the solar wind technique had the power to make plants grow, and if he continued cultivating herbs using that, he wouldn't have any problems living as an irregular. Then the boy consumes the sprout of the purgatory herb. While breathing, the young man thinks about how the heat was spreading similarly to the blue matter. However, the red aura disappears, and the protagonist wonders if he had done something wrong, trying again. But the aura disappears as well. Parcaniel says he thought it was working, and wonders why part of it remained in his lower abdomen. He is confused, wondering if it was because the blue matter from the void was a higher quality drug. While chewing the sprout, he decides to try again. The red aura returns, but this time the heat was different. He then remembers what the internet post said about yin energy. The purgatory herb had a yin nature, while the blue matter from the void had a yang nature. Parcaniel then wonders if this meant he needed to learn an energy absorption technique for yin energy. But if he encountered mixed energies, his life could be in danger as before. In any case, he thinks that it's a relief, because despite the low efficacy, the power could increase. Then the young man uproots the small tree, but a noise ends up startling him. It's just a message on his phone. Upon reading the message, it says that the Majesty's son had died and warns everyone to be careful of the rain, asking all residents to evacuate immediately. People panic, wondering why they weren't warned sooner. Then, a heavy rain begins, and morms appear in the streets. People say it would be less dangerous if they didn't touch them. The protagonist notices that there was a protective barrier around the building and feels relieved for having followed those people there. Outside the building, someone screamed for help. A huge, monstrous bird stands before a woman, and the protagonist is shocked by what he's seeing. The bird uses its claws to lift the woman, throwing her into its nest full of worms. The monster then observes the people inside the barrier. A frightened man says that if he had been late, it would have been him in that situation. Then Parcaniel activates his abilities, thinking that letting a healthy person die made no sense, so he steps out of the barrier to face the creature. He lands a blow on the bird's head. It falls easily to the ground. The protagonist thinks that he didn't remember being that strong, and wonders if it was because of the purgatory herbs he had consumed earlier. But he realizes that the intense rain was the tears of the Dragon King, and the boy had consumed them. The water made the trees grow more and become stronger, because it activates and amplifies his energy from the element of nature. Now the boy could do anything. Therefore, he decides to use artifact refinement on his tree, which now became a demon slayer. Then the bird rises again, furious, and charges toward the young man. However, he defends himself, thinking that if he let his guard down, he would be pushed back and didn't have much time left before hitting the protective barrier, so he needed to hold on. Soon after, the creature opens a gap, and the boy takes advantage and attacks the monster. Realizing that the attack hadn't even scratched it, he wonders if it was because of the demon-slaying blade. The bird gets up again, its eyes fixed on the blade. However, it decides to attack the woman on the ground, but the boy saves her. The woman thanks him, and he replies that it was still too early for her to feel relieved. The bird becomes enraged upon seeing them trying to escape. It strikes them. The wounded manages to return inside the barrier, but Park Hamuel wasn't as lucky and crashed into a wall. However, the boy stands up, relieved as he had no fractures thanks to the layers, although the effect had worn off. The monster flies to attack the protagonist again. He smiles, thinking that a bird that big flying was a total farce. Then he realizes he couldn't run to the shelter anymore because the drug's effect was wearing off, and he was already weakening. He wonders if he should plant sprouts. However, it would be difficult to use that against the monster. But since it was a gamble with slim chances of victory, he could use his trump card. The demon-slaying blade has the characteristics of both a plant and a sword, growing its roots into the ground. It takes time to exchange energy and strengthen it enough. But while the dragon's tears were falling, it was possible to increase the sword's power by using a technique that absorbs the rain and stores the energy of the subdued demon. Now the boy's sword was charged with lightning. Then Park Hamuel charges toward the monster, landing a blow on the beast. Soon after, the monster's head gets stuck in a building. The protagonist takes the opportunity and cuts off its head. The people watching couldn't believe the boy had killed that thing. If someone had been killed by that bird, the authorities wouldn't have paid much attention. But that young man didn't hesitate to save someone in danger. They compared him to a superhero. People started recording videos of the boy. However, the protagonist is suddenly attacked. A man appears, asking if he knew what he had just done. Because he had killed the bird that Mishua cherished, and burning someone like him wouldn't be enough punishment. The video of the protagonist being attacked begins to go viral, and criticism starts to emerge. A woman asks if her child had died, and if that man had burned the insolent one who killed her messenger. Her assistant responds that for now, the boy had been detained. Yoa says it seemed like everyone despised her, as they were only keeping that impertinent boy in custody. She becomes furious, ordering that all humans be told that if they didn't want to suffer her wrath, they should set an example and kill the boy. But her assistant responds that there was a report indicating that the protagonist's actions had become a trending topic. Therefore, the woman should be kind to the boy, as there was a great level of dissatisfaction with the new leadership. Yoa says the rules of that world weren't fun, and the government's rules were frightening. She was sure Vermillion had some way to calm her down, and the maid in turn responds that she had prepared a tribute to ensure Mishua's reputation wouldn't be tarnished. Yoa then says she will wait for it. Soon after, the rain begins to stop, and the woman says the Dragon King had relieved his sorrow. It was just an illusion that transcendent beings were free from desire. Mishua grabs a package and thinks that the important thing was that she managed to obtain it. It was a piece of trunk. That fruit is called the treasure of fantasy, even by the gods, and its flowers only bloom once every 3,000 years. It's a mystical tree that only grows in the orchard of the Queen Mother of the West, the peaches of the tree of immortality. Yoa mentions that when the Queen Mother sacrificed herself to close the gates of heaven, the orchard disappeared, and if she could obtain a sprout from that bark, her name would replace that of the Queen Mother of the West. Park Hanyu is walking down the street, remembering that a man had told him he had made all the deities look like bad people, and that from now on, he shouldn't do anything that made him stand out. Then the protagonist looks at his hand, thinking that even though his sword had been confiscated, he was happy to have obtained that. That night, the boy had found a block of wood in the bird's body, and he wondered why that piece of wood had been stuck to the ankle of that monster. However, he realized that the trunk was alive. Soon after, that man appeared, and the protagonist managed to get a sprout before being attacked, so he wondered if he should try to cultivate it. A year later, a news report says that the government has taken various measures to purify the water. A man complains about the smell. He says the water problem is because of a monster, and that the government should deal with it first. A month ago, when the celestial energy was in disarray, a monster hid in the Han River, a 1,000-year-old snakehead fish. After crossing the world of monsters into a river in the human world, it became powerful enough to claim the title of God, calling itself the sovereign of the Han River. The creature declared that no one could use the river's waters until a human sacrifice was fulfilled. A boy watching the report says that fish seem to have a worm's brain. That was Yang Giju, a disciple from one of the 8 sacred mountains on the Korean peninsula. Then someone tells the boy to avoid making unrelated comments during that meeting, and that it would be better to behave and sit properly. That was Shin Soman, the youngest disciple of one of the 8 sacred mountains on the Korean peninsula. However, the boy didn't care about that meeting. because it wasn't a problem they could discuss and solve alone. And that in the first place, everything was based on the immense will of the elders. But Wona becomes irritated and asks if that's what his master taught him. She says 10,000 people have already contracted diseases because of the water, so they should find a solution as soon as possible. Then she asks how the boy dared to insult her master. Yang Giju asks if the woman was capable of killing the sovereign of the Han River, because 4 of the best immortal mystics tried to stop the creature but failed, and he questions if she wanted everyone to die at the hands of that fish. The difficulty in dealing with the sovereign of the Han River lies in its ability to use both earth and water techniques. Very few people have mastered 2 techniques like the sovereign, so the only way to defeat it is with an immortal who masters earth to force it away, or someone with a high rank in earth and water energy. The boy says he won't stop Yanggiju from making his plans, but he won't participate. The woman becomes angry and breaks the presentation remote. Then the boy leaves to train. He says that if someone could defeat that fish, they would have the solution. The woman walks into a forest, carrying the demon-slaying sword, because she remembered that a year ago, a man killed Yua's bird with that weapon, and although he was imprisoned and eventually released, the sword was confiscated and kept by the Immortal Society. It was a rare wooden tool, and since it was shaped like a sword, it brought much confusion to the heavens. But just as the energy that inhabited the weapon gradually disappeared, the confusion came to an end. Park Hamiel hadn't set foot outside Wanak in the past year. Sometimes he went out to eat with his mother or friends and watched movies in his free time. The girl remembers that he had said he wasn't using any phone apps, so he wouldn't be able to calculate his achievements. Considering what Park Hamiel had been through, it wouldn't be impossible. Then the protagonist appears, and upon seeing the girl, he turns a corner. Young Jaiju thinks she can't lose him, and decides to follow him. However, she can't catch up with the boy, even running at full speed with the help of a talisman. As a result, she loses track of him. But Park Hamiel reappears, asking if she was affiliated with the Immortal Society, and says he had no intention of running away. He was just surprised that the girl was following him. The girl notices that the protagonist was sweating and wonders why he only used physical strength and not a talisman to get rid of her. Then she throws a phone to him. The device has its user changed. After that, Park Hamiel shows his information. Yang Jaiju discovers that he was still a high immortal, but ranked below her. Park asks if Yang wanted to use his wood element to kill the sovereign of the Ham River, wondering if the immortals really wanted that monster dead. That's how he saw things. Yang says no, because the reason her seniors hadn't taken action on that was that they wanted to see the juniors solve the problem without needing their help. The protagonist says that thousands of people were suffering because of it. Accepting the offer, Park asks if, by cooperating, he would be compensated, and if by any chance he could get his sword back. Yang asks how the boy knew about that. Park replies that by breathing he could interact with the trees around him, and that was the function of the technique he had learned. Yang thinks that's the reason Park could run so fast in the forest. Park then says he first wants to know if his curfew would be lifted as a reward. Yang replies that he was allowed to be rewarded, but attracting everyone's attention was a big problem, and besides, there was no one to promise him anything just because he had helped. Yang explains that the curfew was initially imposed by the superiors to punish Park for killing Ms. Yua's bird, but now that incident could easily be resolved if she did everything to persuade that man, helping them get rid of the sovereign of the Han River. Sometime later, Park was already by the riverbank, and the other man asks why they needed to go to that place. He didn't know if Park had come to this place to try something, but it was the nuisance he had seen there because he wanted to see the creature. Yang asks him to calm down, as it was all because of the sovereign of the Han River, wondering what the protagonist could do in that situation. Taking the album out of his backpack, he thinks it was disgusting. He had prepared it for this moment, but he hadn't expected to use it so soon. However, the woman warns the boy that it would be dangerous to get any closer, but she ends up surprised by what the boy was doing. Park asks if she hadn't seen this in elementary school, as he used to germate plants in his class. That plant was very good for purifying water quality, and now it was halfway done with just the rest remaining. At that moment, a giant creature emerges from the lake. The protagonist grabs his sword and gets ready, saying he was about to start fishing for that fish. A thunderous roar echoes through the area. The creature declares that it was the god of that river. Therefore, it wasn't someone who would be obedient to another. It attacks the protagonist, who barely manages to dodge. Soon after, he seems to start casting a spell, hurling at the creature. Furious, it asks how he dared to do such a thing. But at the same moment, it gets hit by several projectiles from the protagonist, leaving the monster even more enraged. Meanwhile, Yang is still protecting the other men, thinking it was impressive, because by using the purifying plants, Park had completely drained all the dirty elements from the river sovereign. However, if he continued at that pace, he simply wouldn't be able to win the battle. The monster says that despite his ability to deal with hard-to-see energy. His petty tricks simply didn't work, attacking the boy again, who, as a consequence, seems to start falling into the lake. However, he throws more of those seeds to support himself, mentioning that this was the last one he had. Throwing it at the monster, the creature says that it was the tree that was struck by lightning, asking if Park intended to destroy its body with that little toy. However, Park says that it was a toy he placed in her heart, asking if she couldn't feel it, and at that moment he starts diving again, saying they would see each other again. Beginning to cast a spell, he says it was a thunderbolt and lightning dart he made himself. Therefore, he couldn't just let the creature leave. He starts electrocuting the entire area, successfully hitting the creature. And a huge explosion engulfs the area, successfully defeating the creature. The protagonist says that now the air was much fresher. Standing on top of the serpent, he says he had committed a bad act again, attracting attention once more, and didn't think it would end well this time. The reason the mortals had neglected the Hand Sovereign was really for the sake of trials and growth. So all of this was for their disciples, not for normal people. Looking around, it seems he found what he was looking for, thinking it was smaller than expected. The inner core of water-based creatures, the reinforced crystals, were rebuilt in the hope of becoming a dragon. For that reason, he decides to take it as a reward for his mission. However, a man suddenly insults the protagonist, asking what he was doing. They quickly use magic to restrain him, asking if the boy knew what he had done. That man was the celestial king called Mikusha. The girl watching from above seems to recognize the man who was restraining the protagonist, remembering the words of that other man to just act like everything was fine until those ungrateful immortals found themselves in trouble and started complaining. Thinking that the fact they had appeared like this, and that the sovereign of the Hand River had been subdued, meant they had altered the fate of the Hand River's death. The girl then greeted the man, saying she didn't know how the seniors had come to that place, and the man questioned whether it was worth saying that the place was safe or authorized, asking if she wasn't the disciple of Tebek, to which she quickly responded that he was correct. The man questioned whether she was saying that a disciple of such a master didn't recognize the gravity of the situation, because that boy she had brought had trained for only 1 year without any master. Even though the wood construction technique is rare, a man who trained without a master for a year used a technique strong enough to defeat a sovereign, asking if she wasn't doubting that guy's identity, and warning her that if she dared to open her mouth again, it would bring great humiliation to Tebek. Completely desperate, the girl seemed to understand the situation. The protagonist then began to laugh. The man asked if he had lost his fear, and Park asked why he would be desperate, wondering if he had done something wrong, because they were doubting him just because he had a unique ability. But unfortunately, this was the second time it had happened, so he was already checking the app. However, it was only 3 minutes after the fish had died that they all appeared. Everyone around seemed confused by what the boy had said. Park said they should have been watching that fish closely, and judging by how they appeared right after its death, asking if they thought that if they had killed that fish, it would be well regarded by the public, and since they'd ruin everything they could have used to grow, they came running to that place in desperation. The boy, now completely irritated, told them to stop. Soon after, an explosion happened, claiming that it was the protagonist who caused it. However, he ended up surprised, because his attack had no effect. Park said he always aimed for the stomach, just like before, and then he pointed a sword at the man, who became completely enraged, asking if Park knew what it meant to point a sword at him, and if he had any last words before he died. However, to Park, it wasn't as if he would die, because the man wouldn't be able to kill him. About to attack the protagonist, the man said that his arrogance reached the heavens, unleashing an attack on the protagonist. Then, a massive explosion occurred, and the man seemed surprised, because someone else had arrived to interrupt the fight, saying that the watchman should guard the garden, questioning what he wanted in that place. The name of that man was Bank, a high-level immortal from the 3 realms of heaven. Bank said he had a request for his lady. He hoped he hadn't interrupted their display of power, but this was just unjustified violence. And now, from what he saw, that boy was quite foolish. However, if they wanted to fight, he wouldn't stop them, because both would have a bad reputation. But the boy had no justification, so please, they shouldn't get in the elder's way. And soon after, the two disappeared. Then the man asked why that lady had to call Elder Bank to save the protagonist. Sometime later, the young man seemed to be walking somewhere with Bank, asking if the young man knew he would appear, and if that was why he had been so bold, mentioning that you would give him some advice, saying that he might think he was special, but uncommon arrogance leads to ruin. Hearing what the man had said, the protagonist remained silent, saying that he would keep that in mind, thanking the elder for his advice. Thus, a year and a half had passed since that day, and he still remembered how confused he was with all the setbacks he had that day. No matter how good his intentions were, they weren't well received by everyone. Therefore, he had prepared carefully since the story of the Han River Sovereign began to unfold. For that reason, he wouldn't have to go through that again, and he wouldn't act without knowing things, nor would he be treated as a fool. He wouldn't be the victim as he was that time. Miss Yua has a garden, not just any garden, but one where divine medicinal herbs are carefully selected and cultivated. But the story about that garden could have just been a rumor. So he devised a plan to see solid evidence, a plan to attract the attention of the lady who had the garden. That's why now he was prepared, standing in front of her. Yua asked if he had mentioned his name was Park, and then questions if the young man knew what those were. The boy responds that they were seeds of the purgatory grass. The woman says that such a precious thing had been discovered by mortals repressing it on the black market. She had investigated the seller to punish him severely. Sensing the gravity of the situation, the protagonist kneels, admitting that he had sinned gravely. He explains that he had no choice, as his living conditions were very poor. However, the woman asks him to lift his head, saying that it was all fine now as he had paid for his sins. But she only showed mercy so the punishment would be balanced, because the price for killing her bird wasn't light. She would show mercy once again. She then asks why he didn't work in her garden, because she personally had a garden that cultivated grasses and herbs. And if the boy was capable of cultivating purgatory grass, he certainly had enough skill to cultivate common aquatic plants that had purified the poison of the sovereign of the Han River. Park thanks her, saying she thought so highly of him. But the reason behind his plant cultivation was all due to the technique he had learned. But Yua says that using that technique, it should take only a day or two for common plants to start bearing fruit. However, Park replies that the purgatory grass hadn't grown more than a sprout, and no matter how much time or effort he dedicated to it, it wouldn't grow any further. The woman then asks if he's saying he lacks dexterity, and the protagonist admits that this is true. The woman then comments that he had more courage than appeared, and couldn't believe what he was negotiating with her. She mentions that she would support him with some divine medicinal herbs from her garden for proper tools. In addition, she would accompany him to help him become enlightened. For that reason, she would assign another young man to assist him. Nearly again, the protagonist thanks her for her mercy. However, this had always been part of his plan. Giving a signal to the other girl, Yua asks if she had been in that place all along. The girl quickly approaches her master. The woman asks what her verdict is, and the girl mentions that Park seemed very suspicious. Because he was being so cordial, it looked as if he were plotting something. Moreover, she had heard that he was the one who killed her bird, and even defeated the sovereign of the Han River. The boy wasn't experienced, but for him to achieve so much could only mean he was either a genius or truly an idiot. The girl asks if her master knew he had been scheming from the start, but still accepted him. That was why her master had asked her to keep an eye on him. However, the woman tells her not to worry so much, as she would let him manage the 6th garden first. And even if he had bad intentions, he wouldn't be able to obtain even a single seed from her garden. And if the boy turned out to be useless, it could turn him into fertilizer for her garden. The girl thinks they had decided to work together because of the Peninsula Peach, but Yua was a lady she couldn't quite like. Even so, she hoped the protagonist would be more useful. Meanwhile, Park is walking down the street, thinking that the power of the immortal hidden in that place was over 300, and Yua's power exceeded 400. Park had reached 10 stars in the Star Wind technique over the past year, so he could roughly gauge others' power, but he didn't fully trust those numbers. The Celestial King and that temperamental man were above 600. Additionally, Beck had a power level exceeding 400. The protagonist, on the other hand, had about 45. He thought about how he had learned all the Star Wind techniques during the past year, but they were only theoretical. For that reason, he still had much more work to do. Arriving at his destination, he thinks he's finally where he needed to be, and at that moment, he stumbles upon a glowing sacred tree. He says that today he brought something for the tree, and it was the centimani from the sovereign of the Han River. Since he was giving one to the tree, he should also receive one in return. Sometime later, the young man seems to be meditating in front of the tree, when suddenly he wakes up, surprised because the smell of those peaches was so good. He managed to improve his attack power just by sitting in front of it. The breathing peach had been training its form for the past year, but it was only in this last week that the flowers of this tree had bloomed and bore several fruits. Even so, they were still quite small. However, as they had grown and matured, at least now he could eat a bit. Right after, a voice tells the boy not to be so hasty. Looking to the side, Park seems surprised. A small bear had started talking to him. Park in turn asks if he could know who he was. The bear then says that the elder had named him Guanaki, so Park asks if he was the mountain god known as Guanascan. thinking that after the gates of heaven opened, the deities began to reveal their existence. And this one, in particular, had been quite unlucky. Hundreds of years ago, when the capital was moved to Hangguang, the land officials believed that the fire energy from Mount Guanascan effectively affected Hinawan. By adding water energy using the mythical statue of the unicorn lion, along with the excavation of the Blue Lagoon, among other things, they constantly awakened the energy of Mount Guanascan. That's why this bear was only half his height. Park mentions that he had been training in that place for over a year, so he thought he would have already met him. However, he had only encountered him at that moment. The bear explains that it was because he didn't see any reason to interfere with a devotee who was training. Park wonders if the bear's goal might be the peach, but since the tree had distorted the area, he couldn't enter the barrier. He asked the bear to wait a bit because he just had to eat something. However, the bear again asks him not to do that, asking if he hadn't heard what he just said. Because it would be very reckless, the tree's energy is centered in the fruit, and if he took it now, the tree's protection wouldn't work at all. Asking what the boy would do if the people who were watching the tree took it. Park asks if the bear was going to steal the tree, and the bear asks if he looked like a thief. But it wasn't just him. Sooner or later, some people would notice the existence of that place. And right now, there's someone at the end of the hill waiting for the protagonist. Looking up, Park notices the giant barrier, supposing that it was a tremendous yi energy. Pointing his finger upward, the bear says he had warned him before, and if they were attacking the barrier so much, it could mean they were determined to get him there. Or perhaps they were after the peach from the tree of immortality that was growing. Park says that maybe it's the peach mentioned in the Journey to the West, the one the Monkey King eats. But the bear tells him to forget about that. The important thing is that one of the top Taoists was after him, someone using fire techniques. With his training, the boy was able to traverse forms of the tree. A mere human body cannot digest the effects of the peach of immortality. However, the bear was different, and that's why he should give the fruit to him. Only then would he regain his spiritual energy to protect him and the tree from that man. However, Park apologizes again and begins to eat the peach, leaving the bear completely shocked, wondering who this boy was. But still, that was the peach of immortality that had transformed the Monkey King into the strongest man. Wondering what would happen to the protagonist, and at the same moment, the system announces that the drug has been consumed. Park immediately sits down to meditate. The bear asks how he's feeling, and if he's noticed any changes in his body. The young man responds that the peach was very sweet and fresh, leaving the bear speechless with what he had just heard, calling him an idiot. Park in turn thinks the bear really got worked up, but no matter what breathing technique he tried, he couldn't control the heat moving freely through his body, although it wasn't anything like the heat that bothered him last time. This feeling was gentler. The bear explains that it takes 3,000 years to produce a low-level fruit, so one that grew in a year must be of very low quality. Park, for his part, says he's having trouble, and asks if the bear could help him. The bear says he couldn't help even if he wanted to, because he didn't have the power for that. Right after, the protagonist throws a seed at the bear's forehead, leaving the bear completely irritated by what he had done. However, the bear then realizes what was thrown at him, asking if that wasn't a purgatory seed, and if he was giving him something as precious as that. The protagonist then gently hands him several of those seeds, mentioning that at the moment that's all he had, asking if the bear would be able to recover with all of that. To which the bear quickly responds that it would be easy. Park, in turn, asks what he could do now. Then the bear replies that from now on he could start selling caves. Park was left completely shocked by what he had heard. The bear told him that with just those 3 purgatory grass sprouts, it wouldn't be enough to restore his power. The protagonist asked if there was anything else he could do, and the bear asked if he had anything else up his sleeve besides that. Park then mentioned he could check something, accessing the system, and said it had that function. Observing it, the bear noted it was the map of that area. Meanwhile, Park realized he'd have to deal with the person approaching. The bear asked if Park was thinking of fighting, and the protagonist confirmed it, saying that if he just left things as they were, his tree could be taken away. The bear thought it was obvious that Park would lose with his current power, and wondered what the boy could be thinking, seeing how calm he was. In that moment, the young man started running toward the approaching figure. The man thought he had finally found the protagonist. Soon after, Park was standing in front of him. Sensing the energy, the man asked if Park was a disciple of the Celestial King, and whether his master had ordered him to take Park back. Quickly, the young man replied that he was correct, and added that they had even given him an item, the nine-tailed fox fan. The bear exclaimed that the nine-tailed fox fan had only been seen once 300 years ago. He couldn't believe that such a treasure was created from the tail of a fox, as it was extremely rare. Being a treasure, the tail remained intact, and the phantom energy it contained must be truly formidable. The man confirmed that the fan indeed belonged to the nine-tailed fox. Park, however, asked even if it were the Celestial King's fan. Would he really cause an explosion in a place filled with people? The man then asked if Park couldn't feel the energy of the area, saying that no matter what skill he used, or how much he screamed, No one would escape. The bear interjected, explaining that the man's unusual energy was due to the treasure he was using, which contained the power of 4 celestial beasts. The man, growing irritated, asked why the bear always interrupted him. However, Park didn't even know about that. Angry, the man said even that small creature was interfering, asking why the bear was always getting involved in his affairs, and instead of taking the life of the fish, he would take Park's life, watching the situation unfold. Park thought that his power had momentarily reached close to 105 times stronger than his initial power with that sacred item. It felt like an item from a fantasy game, purchased with money. So if a shit arrived, he spread his energy across the mountain, lowering his abilities. Park didn't believe he was truly gathering energy. Realizing the situation, the protagonist started using one of his skills called wind distribution, thinking that he was gathering the energy he had distributed. In a matter of seconds, the man launched an attack at the protagonist, which Park simply shattered. The bear was left speechless by what he had witnessed, wondering if such martial arts techniques were even possible. Park asked if he had mentioned before that no matter what happened, nothing would leave that place, because if someone was trying to brandish their weapon against another, they had to be prepared to face a counterattack. The man's shock asked how a bastard without proper teachings could dare challenge him, but at that moment something strange started happening. A blue glow began to surround the boy, and immediately the young man collapsed, unconscious, onto the ground. Park approached to check if the young man was okay, saying that when he recklessly wielded the fan, hoping to obtain power greater than his own, his soul was absorbed into it, instead of his power. However, Park didn't fully believe that was the case. Bear commented that if the right person had achieved this, the entire mountain would have blown up. Park wondered if a sacred item was truly that powerful, and if it was, he needed that item. Suddenly, an explosion erupted. It seemed the man from earlier was attacking the barrier, grabbing his disciple. The man said it was an unbelievable mistake. He couldn't believe that a disciple of the Celestial King had become a fool in his domain, and it was clear that the child would not be able to escape the wrath of the Celestial King again, even if he were the commander of the Immortal Society, or a master of the Red Martial Arts. It was nothing compared to the 8 sacred monks. Park in turn said that he had done everything purely in self-defense. Park thought that self-defense also applied to the man attacking him, and he began to prepare his counterattack. Irritated, the elder said he should have burned Park a year ago. He couldn't understand why the Celestial King wanted a walking disaster like him, but now that it had come to this, he would burn Park completely, leaving only his bones behind. Yet the protagonist coldly observed the situation, without any reaction. In a matter of seconds, Park began to run. The man continued to pursue him relentlessly, casting multiple spells at the boy. Feeling cornered, Park admitted he was at a disadvantage. He thought that his compatibility with the situation didn't seem favorable. Out of all the elements, fire was the least suited for him. The bear urged him to use the 9-tailed fox fan quickly, by just inserting energy into it and wielding it. The bear explained it should work no matter the element used, but then the elder cast a spell that struck the poor bear. Meanwhile, the protagonist pondered the bear's idea, wondering if his soul would be sucked in just like the other boys. Still, with no other option, he decided to try anyway. He began casting a spell with the fan's ability. Irritated, the elder shouted, asking how Park dared to use the 9-tailed fox fan, but all the attacks ended up hitting the elder instead, leaving Park completely stunned by what he was witnessing. This was truly the power of a sacred item. He wondered where the man had gone. At that very moment, Park was struck from behind. He suffered a severe wound, suspecting that one of his organs had been injured. Rising amidst the flames, the elder said it was pathetic. Not only had Park turned the Celestial King's disciple into a fool, now he was using the 9-tailed fox fan. Park couldn't believe he had survived. He questioned how so-called immortals could be like this. The elder started casting multiple spells at Park, declaring that this would be his end. The spells hit the poor boy, dealing him a fatal blow. The elder mentioned that he wouldn't let Park use those dirty tricks again, and so he would take him to the Celestial King. The young man, overwhelmed, wondered if this was the moment he would die. He supposed that if his body had been fully restored, he could have won. However, he was confused as to why the pain had suddenly vanished. Then a peach began to float in the air. The system announced that the drug analysis was complete. A long time ago, the Monkey King sought freedom from interference, and so he obtained his skin. He wasn't harmed by the many sacred items wielded by the celestial realm. He endured 49 days on the 8-fold celestial path, even under the pressure of Buddha's 5 fingers. His skin lasted approximately 500 years. Thus, Dong sought a body invulnerable to death. He managed to acquire cells that even the cruelest death arts performed by the envoys of the land of the dead couldn't harm. Eventually, even the king of the underworld gave up on killing him. The system announced again that the drug had been consumed, and the properties of the drug were from the peach. Its function was to create custom devices optimized for an element, and this is how Park gained the power he had desired. The device was responsible for various metabolic actions, including neutralizing poisons. Park's new liver filled his body from head to toe with cold water. Opening his eyes, the protagonist appeared completely different from before. The Elder, apparently noticing the transformation, wondered how Park had acquired water energy. Then he realized he had made a grave mistake. Park, it turned out, was an irregular. Park himself didn't understand how it had happened, but for now, he was just glad he wasn't feeling hot anymore. He picked up the nine-tailed fox fan again, launching another attack at the Elder. The man, completely in disbelief, was struck by the attack, and thus, the battle ended. Park collapsed to the ground, unconscious. While the bear frantically urged him to open his eyes, Park slowly regained consciousness. The bear asked that he was back to his senses. The bear remarked that he didn't want to discuss what had happened. Questioning if Park should leave the place filled with water, Park, still confused, looked around. He realized that the entire area was submerged in water. He couldn't comprehend what was going on. Checking the Elder's body, Park muttered that he had heard about a flag that acted as a remote control for the barrier, wondering where it was. Observing the situation, Park seemed surprised. He then found a kind of red talisman. The bear, on the other hand, said that it was a treasure pouch. In summary, it was a magical bag created to store small and large items. However, the bear reminded Park that this was no time to be playing around, as he bet there were several people heading toward their location. As Park carried the man on his back, the bear asked where on earth he was going. Realizing he had dropped the man on the ground, the bear questioned what Park was thinking. The bear warned that if they stayed there, others might discover the location of the tree. Starting to cast a spell, Park calmly asked the bear to relax. Using his magic, Park seemed to be planning something to deceive their pursuers. The bear was astonished by what he was witnessing. He thought Park was absorbing the upper tuus body into the tree to germinate a new bloom of fruit. Park commented that luckily they weren't too late. Noticing more people approaching, he remarked that they had completed the task just in time. The bear explained that the peach tree had blossomed, opening its barrier, which was why they hadn't been found yet. However, the bear grumbled that it was a shame, since if the tuas hadn't been of the fire element, another fruit couldn't have grown from the tree. Taking advantage of the discussion about the fruit, Park asked if it had any special medicinal effects, but the bear responded that he didn't know. Being such a precious treasure, only a few people had knowledge of its true nature. Since nothing had changed in Park, the bear speculated that perhaps the fruit wasn't fully matured, which was why it hadn't had any effect yet. Park thought that if he could truly enhance his power through his liver, his water energy could increase. There was much to consider about that, and he wondered what would happen if he ate a fruit that had been cultivated for a long time. Meanwhile, the bear seemed to want to ask something, inquiring if the boy could show him what the outside world was like. Park questioned if it was possible for a deity to leave its mountain, and the bear explained that he just needed to share his alter ego. However, the bear needed power to do that, and Park thought the bear would cling to him like gum. The bear, however, said he had no other way to implode and follow Park. Now that their paths had crossed, the bear said he could see the world and all the good things through him. Observing the situation, Park seemed to accept the bear's offer, but in return, he demanded something that the bear had. Without hesitation, the bear handed over a weapon to the young man. As Park examined it, the bear began to explain that for a long time, including across the Korean peninsula, there had been a presence that appeared throughout East Asia. This presence was a fantasy race with intellectual abilities called goblins. Not only did they possess excellent basic skills, but they also had a spiritual physique. Their nature was remarkable, as they had exclusive weapons that refined their abilities. These were the goblin's helmet and club. As Park continued examining the weapon, he asked if he could use it, as he thought the book said only the original owner could wield it. The bear confirmed this was true, but added that it was an important treasure that could be exchanged with a goblin for anything. The helmet and the club were not items that could be crafted twice. Losing either one meant the owner lost half of their power. Park remarked that if the bear still had it, it meant he didn't even know who the original owner was. From what the bear had said, Park thought it didn't sound bad. Accepting the club, Park said they would start traveling together, making the bear happy. Park then said that now they should focus on working for the Lady of the Garden. But before that, you would collect the special items from the unconscious people around. Meanwhile, with the upcoming Hibyuji 22 summit scheduled for the 31st of that month, the government had made special plans to meet privately with the heads of high-ranking states. A man mentioned that he had heard the summit's reason was related to something called the Tower of Marbling. However, Park corrected the man, saying it was called Babel. The The Tower of Babel was an unprecedented structure built by ancient humans to reach the heavens. Although it differed slightly from a myth of the past, the Tower of Babel had existed long before the gates of heaven were closed, and in the current dynasty of the Immortals, it was to be rebuilt according to Babylon's design. However, if the tower were rebuilt through this project, all the world's languages could be disrupted. It was clear that this would have its advantages, but the consequences would also be significant. For one, many businesses were built around translations. Park thought to himself that this was another global story unrelated to him, concluding that this world had nothing to do with him. In an instant, an accident occurred. Quickly, Park got up, questioning what had just happened. However, he was surprised by what he saw. The girl from before was standing in front of the car, ordering him to get out of there. She introduced herself as Jack Xiangbi and mentioned that she had been asked to help him for the moment. However, if he involved her in any stupidity, he would regret it. The boy, in turn, promised he would be careful not to do that. Shortly after, the bear, now transformed into part of his phone case, muttered the name of the girl again, whispering that the protagonist was in for a rough time. Park asked if the bear knew the girl, and the bear replied that he knew her just a little. The bear then asked if Park wanted to know her weaknesses. He explained that the girl simply adored handsome men, leaving Park completely confused by what he had heard. A long time ago, on Jeju Island, Mong Dorian, the son of the deity called Moon, was famous for his beauty. Jack Xiangbi, however, was an ordinary girl. She encountered the man while he was bathing, and as a result, her spiritual physique awakened, despite the gates of heaven being closed. Returning to the present, Park couldn't believe that story. It seemed too impossible. The bear remarked that sometimes people awaken when their body and mind experience a great shock. These individuals were chosen and nurtured by deities in the human world. Since Jack Xiangbi had the same celestial physique as the Moon family, the other man had accepted her offer. Thus, Jack Xiangbi pursued that young man. However, it was clear that Moon did not recognize the girl, who was an immortal without a patron. The girl, completely furious, questioned why she wouldn't have reasons to be acknowledged, and for that reason, she vowed to give Moon enough reasons to notice her. In less than 100 years, Jack Xiangbi had conquered Jeju Island. She became known as the Chosen Flower, who would reach the heavens and sweep across the world. After establishing a dynasty, Jack Xiangbi formally proposed marriage to Moon. However, her father, fearing the girl's power, devised a way to banish her. As she prepared for the wedding, dreaming of a happy future, she was betrayed. On the day of the wedding, a conspiracy unfolded against her. Assassins came to kill a poor girl, not her beloved, but murderers armed and ready. Enraged, the beautiful woman destroyed everyone who conspired against her. Even though they used the deadly Sura flower of extinction technique, they couldn't escape. Thus, the battle of that day became known as the Great Battle that almost sank the island. But in the end, she was the only one who lost. For that day, she had been betrayed by her own love. Aiming to use her abilities, some regents tried to approach her. They sent young, handsome men, as the rumor said she liked that, but none of them could escape death. The bear asked Part if he didn't feel relieved, considering the girl had no reason to hate him, because after all, the protagonist wasn't exactly handsome. This irritated Park, who asked if the bear wanted to be sent back to the mountain. Shortly after, the girl asked what Park was doing. They had already arrived at their destination. Climbing the stairs, Park apologized for the earlier incident. The warrant explained that there were 6 gardens in the castle, each numbered from 1 to 6. Among them, the only place Park could stay was the 6th garden. Park assumed the 6th was the worst of them, and didn't expect to have access to precious medicinal herbs right away. But even so, he was shocked by what he saw. He couldn't believe there were 2 suns in that place. He questioned why such a place was so miserable. The warrant explained that each gate had a different space-time, a different realm within that world. From now on, the protagonist would be the lord of that place, responsible for cultivating crops. Park asked who the previous leader of the place was, and the girl questioned if he really thought there had been one. The place had been closed since the death of the last lord 100 years ago. The young man thought that as the world changed and the number of mortals increased, the value of herbs rose due to the increased demand. The girl mentioned that just because Park was in that place didn't mean he wouldn't be well paid. When harvest time approached, he could make a lot of money, especially since there were no other gardeners. Shortly after, the girl bid him farewell. Park's phone suddenly started ringing, causing him to drop it on the ground. As a result, his phone's wallpaper became visible. In that moment, a flashback of what the bear had said earlier flooded Park's mind. He quickly muttered that he respected the girl. Sometime later, Park opened his eyes. Meanwhile, the bear was munching on something, remarking that Park had finally woken up. He noted that the boy had been out for nearly 2 hours. Park asked what had happened, and the bear replied that it was a clean hit. It was the first time he had seen someone perform such a move without using a technique. Even though this sixth garden was the worst among the others, only carefully selected seeds were cultivated there. The bear suggested Park should take advantage of that. Park reflected that the girl had said she would observe while the place was maintained until the next harvest. If he demonstrated some skill, he might be able to request the cultivation of more valuable plants. For example, the peaches he had eaten before, or perhaps something even more precious. He considered using the sixth garden to further strengthen himself. Therefore, he wouldn't let anyone touch it or harm his family in this world of untamed mortals. But to achieve that, he first needed to do something about the wasteland before him. Looking around, he realized the place was a complete mess. Reaching into his backpack, he found that his belongings were completely burned, but he already knew that, having overused them in his last battle. He mentioned that his sword had saved his life countless times, thanking it for all it had done. The bear observed Park, astonished by how sincerely he prayed. It was just a plant, but it could light up the sky without regret. At that moment, the sword transformed into a giant tree. Its roots began to envelope the entire area. The bear, shocked, wondered how such a thing was possible. He thought the burned spirit would take at least a month to restore itself, but it happened so quickly. Meanwhile, Park ordered the other trees to rise. Using his ability, he summoned wooden monsters. He instructed them to handle the agricultural tasks. The group started analyzing the trees. The bear remarked that it was incredible. Park had summoned the living spirits of the trees, something even high-ranked immortals struggled to do. However, Park said he needed to rest now, having used a lot of energy. While Park entered the house, he marveled at how much larger it was than he had imagined. He sat down to meditate, thinking he needed to regain energy using his breathing techniques. He soon became completely focused, but suddenly, he stood up. He was certain he felt a plant responding to his breathing. He supposed it might be under the floor, so he decided to use the remaining seeds to uncover whatever it was. He began digging into the ground, leaving the bear utterly surprised, asking what the boy was doing. In that moment, something appeared among the rubble. Suddenly, an explosion occurred. Park, shocked, analyzed what had been buried underground. He questioned what the red circle was. The bear explained that it was a blood barrier, and whoever made it must have held immense, uncommon resentment. Park thought the pulse had been coming from beneath it. He wanted to break the circle. He began attacking the barrier. Then, to his astonishment, he uncovered a secret chamber beneath the ground. The chamber belonged to Park, the Lord of the Sixth Garden, also known by his pseudonym. From then on, the next Lord of the Sixth Garden would tell of the atrocities committed by the lady of the castle. One day, on his way home after partying with a friend, he accidentally wandered into a shrine, and a guardian deity there had been possessed by a ghost. At the time, unable to do much, a kind scholar passing by helped him. The scholar successfully exorcised the ghost from him. After doing so, the man mentioned that Park would soon be fine. However, if a ghost had lashed onto him, it meant his spiritual physique was awakening. That meant if he remained in the human world in this state, he would either be pursued by immortals or tormented by wandering spirits. But there was no need to worry, as the scholar knew of an immortal who could guide him. Following the scholar's advice, Park entered the pavilion of the lady of the castle. She said that if he cultivated his mortal sense and dedicated himself to practice, he could transcend. However, since he was born as immortal, it would be like trying to grasp a star in the night sky. And without making progress, that boy did work everywhere. Eventually, his debt kept increasing. At that point, he thought there was nothing more he could do about it, but that wasn't the case. When he was nearing 30, he met a child like him who came from the human world with their own spiritual physique awakened. The circumstances that brought that child there were so shocking to him. However, it was in the same way that the man had come to that place. He realized that he truly had been possessed by a ghost. And not because he had stepped into the temple of a tutelary deity, but because a scholar had placed ghosts on him to awaken his spiritual physique. Thus, that boy had merely been a pawn on his chessboard. After realizing that, he understood that he couldn't live his whole life as a servant. So he bowed his head to anyone who had mastered the earth art and begged to be trained. However, even after gathering and learning all of that, his mortal body, which had no power, grew weak as he aged. And in that state, he was given a nickname. They called him Foxtail Grass. Whenever he bowed due to his hard work, they said he looked like the grass that grew everywhere, and so he received that pseudonym. When that happened, he truly thought of the end of his life as he felt utterly powerless. Then a miracle occurred. That lady rewarded him with gratitude for sacrificing so much. Thus, he was chosen to be the Lord of the Sixth Garden. There was no way he couldn't feel moved by that. He vowed never to forget the lady's grace and to fulfill his duties as the Lord of the Sixth Garden until the day he died. From that day forward, he dedicated himself to mastering the Earth Dragon art of the Sixth Garden. As a result, his power grew day by day, and he finally reached the point where he was on the verge of becoming an immortal mystic. However, even though he achieved so much, his body had grown even weaker. Only then did he understand the secret of the Earth Dragon art. Its effect was excellent, but it was being absorbed by the medicinal herbs of the Sixth Garden surrounding his body. Without realizing it, he had become a living fertilizer. He realized that his life wouldn't last much longer. Reading the book, Hark was shocked, thinking that he had only seen such things on TV, and that immortals were really capable of doing that. He said that, although he had assumed as much, he had nothing in common with what had been described. The bearer said it was a common practice, as immortals use such acts as a way to maintain the immortal realm. In a way, Park wondered if that meant he could end up like that man. And if someone had the ability to break through the barrier that man had created with his blood, there was no doubt that person was capable and exceptional enough to burn down the cursed pavilion. For his juniors who were in the same situation as him, he should escape with the stolen treasure, risking his life to protect it. Park wondered if perhaps those things belonged to the people mentioned in that testament. As he looked through the contents, he realized they were mandrake seeds cultivated by people of color across the oceans. Picking up another object, Park asked what it was. The book didn't mention anything about it, and the bearer responded that it was like a container where people and temples drew lots. Park was surprised, realizing that the beats he had been hearing weren't coming from the seed, but from that object. He wondered if he should use them to cultivate something. Suddenly, an explosion occurred. The object seemed to resist growing along with him. Picking up the object again, he asked what it was. He said it felt familiar, questioning whether it was a blade shaft. The bearer then revealed that it was a sword. Meanwhile, the lady seemed to be analyzing something. She remarked that the man had indeed traveled to that place. Then a girl appeared. She said she knew it was rude, but insisted they act first because it was an urgent matter. She mentioned that she had heard Yunwo had a treasure in her main palace. That's why she wanted it to be returned. The seven-branched sword was a very strange item, and it was valuable even in the place where the sword was made. That place originally was a country that couldn't establish itself. This was because among the three kingdoms, only Baksh didn't have enough power to support the creation of a nation. The city of Silla was the first to be created by a man who possessed an irregular physique, and the city of Goguryeo was created by a saint, the son of the previous lady, with the blessings of the ancestral spirits of the Korean peninsula. However, King Anju ended up raising that man through human power without any supernatural ability or past. He eventually awakened his mundane physique and belatedly acquired the gold element. Thus, he mastered martial arts, learning to manage his energy on his own. And though King Anju was human, he was a rare genius. That man was at his peak due to King Anju's abilities, but over time, due to the lack of skill in subsequent kings, Baksh eventually declined. Even the traces of its existence faded over the years, but one thing remained standing. He was compared to the genius King Anju, a saint prince who extended Baksh's power to the continent and the archipelago. Moreover, the seven-branched sword was a masterpiece created by the saint prince, a precious item that could be ranked among the great sacred artifacts. Returning to the present, the woman asked if they had received the blade before, and the girl responded that it was all they knew so far. In the past, there was a record that when the king was about to present the sword to the celestial king, a messenger carrying the sword died of natural causes. However, fortunately, the ship carrying the sword was recovered safely, but the blade was never delivered to its country. The lady, in turn, questioned whether the girl was implying that the seven-branched sword possessed some kind of axis. She mentioned that it was very strange, as it seemed she had realized the existence of an axis a long time ago. She wondered why the girl was inquiring about it only now, but the girl replied that she had not come to ask meaningless questions. In the name of the sanctuary, she was there to propose a celestial lease for a period of 6 months. Understanding the situation, the lady of the garden asked what the conditions were. The other woman stated that they would wager the blade of the seven-branched sword in the middle of that battle. She requested that if they did not win, they would be allowed to take something from the lady's property, and if the axis of the seven-branched sword was found there, she promised not to take anything else. Shortly after, the lady of the garden accepted the offer, asking to add one more condition. Half of that event, 6 months had passed. A group of people was discussing the matter as they were planning to broadcast the next celestial fight in real time. Moreover, the lady herself had said she would reveal it, and another man asked why they would broadcast it. While it was entertaining to watch, they were almost at the 6th garden. They should avoid causing discord with the Lord of the 6th garden while approaching their progress and refrain from making any trouble during the visit. Sometime later, the group arrived at the location. They were completely surprised by what was inside, since the place had once been desolate. Meanwhile, the protagonist in the background was eating while reading a book, noticing that the guests had arrived. The young man in turn seemed shocked by what the protagonist was doing, as he was relaxed and eating while observing them. He asked Park to at least show some respect in their presence. Quickly, Park stood up and greeted them, mentioning that his name was Park, the Lord of the 6th Garden. The other boy introduced himself, saying his name was Lee, and he was there to report the garden's progress. Showing a system window on his phone, Park asked why his juniors insisted on calling him their senior. Realizing that the boy was a celestial immortal, everyone around was shocked. Then Park asked if a celestial fight was about to take place. They confirmed that this was what they had said, mentioning that even the supreme immortal, along with 2 players from each ranking, would be participating from the Japanese side. Park remarked that he hadn't heard of such an event, as he didn't go out often, and asked if the boy was going to circle around there. Lee quickly responded that things had turned out that way. The boy's name was Lee, and it was said that during the Korean War, he awakened his spiritual physique after the shock of losing his family in a bombing. Later, he joined the pavilion of the lady. Although he could be downgraded, he still possessed skills and was a talented person who shone intensely after meeting a true master. Meanwhile, Park thought he couldn't trust most mortals, but that boy seemed different from all the others, as he had immediately apologized earlier for his servant's bad behavior. Park remarked that he couldn't believe he was going to participate in the celestial fight and bet that he was the strongest immortal. The boy then said that although he was still weak, the lady had given him the opportunity to participate in that grand event. However, there were very strong contenders there. For example, one named Go, who was nearly a pure immortal and was said to be related to the bloodline of the lady's son. He mentioned that he was lucky to be in a celestial fight against someone like him. Meanwhile, Park seemed to be analyzing that boy from earlier. The group associated with the lady seemed to be discussing something, mentioning that the sanctuary had accepted their proposal. The mortals supported them so much because they had killed some creatures, and if they played an active role in the matter of national pride, they would receive more donations and praise than that girl who had previously slain a creature. At that moment, another woman appeared to interrupt the conversation, mentioning that the Lord of the 6th Garden had gone to meet her. However, the lady asked to keep him waiting as they were having a family meeting. But the woman said that the protagonist had said something that had greatly angered her. Standing up, another boy became furious, questioning if that newcomer dared to challenge him. However, the lady said that in her view, it wasn't bad to deal with the protagonist. There was a rumor that he was staying in the celestial rank on purpose because he was afraid to compete with others. So if the boy didn't like that kind of rumor circulating, he should accept the challenge and show his best skills. Observing the situation, the lady of the garden said the woman was right, asking if he could defeat that boy. However, the young man seemed reluctant. Sometime later, the two were already in a duel, with the lady and several others watching the battle. Meanwhile, the boy glared at the protagonist, telling him not to blame him if he burned in agony. Surprised, Park thought that the young man was staring at him with murderous intent. At that moment, the judge announced that the battle could begin. Then the young man started throwing various spells at Park, and in defense, the protagonist used his magic. The other boy asked if Park thought he could stop his attack with just a shield of leaves, as that shield couldn't even hold its own petals. So he would never let him have fun with that ability again. Never. He began to summon a kind of magical meteor. With a threatening look, he declared that it was the end for Park. However, the protagonist seemed fearless, also preparing a spell, saying that it would be the opposite. He would be the one to kill the boy. In an instant, the two spells collided, but the protagonist's magic easily blocked the boy's, leaving him completely shocked as the shield was absorbing his power. Then a giant explosion began to engulf the area. Suddenly, a man appeared in the middle of the battle, apologizing for his interference. Before the protagonist stood an unknown man who said he couldn't let a child die, as he already knew who the winner was. However, the boy protested, saying he could still fight and that the man shouldn't interfere in the battle. But the man replied that he was sure the victory belonged to the protagonist, as his talents would never disgrace the pavilion. Observing the situation, the lady remained silent, stating that she accepted the outcome, as the man's words carried weight and the protagonist's talents were indeed valuable. Shortly after, The lady called for Park. Meanwhile, the boy was watching the man, wondering who he was. Sometime later, the lady was discussing with Park, asking what kind of training he had done over the past 6 months. Park replied that due to the nature of the earth element and the growing pace of martial arts, the training had been very fast. He knew the lady had brought him to cultivate something, and if she wanted, she could simply order him, as he was doing at that moment. He assured her she could trust him, as he didn't want to betray her. The lady remarked that his words were very bold, asking if he had been planning that from the beginning. She asked him to stay in the competition for now, as she would think of 2 places for him. As Park was about to leave, he mentioned that he had one last question to ask, questioning if he could leave for a while. Sometime later, Park seemed to be walking alongside the man from earlier. He thought that when the lady mentioned he would have a companion, he didn't expect it to be this man. Park then asked if he could know the man's name. The man replied that his name was Dan Deok, but Park could call him Ryung if he wanted. Park thought that, unlike the first time he had appeared, this man was indeed quite flexible. Looking to the side, Park asked if the man by any chance wanted to have a drink at that moment. Sometime later, the two seemed to be enjoying themselves while walking. The man said that even though he knew about such things, the situations in the human world were incomparable to the immortal realm. The protagonist was pleased, mentioning that he was happy because Ryung was enjoying himself. He remarked that he had heard that immortals sometimes visited the human world, asking if he had ever been there. The man responded that yes, when he died in the human world, he became an immortal with the help of the lady. However, he was devastated when he discovered that he would live in the immortal world and not the human one. Observing the situation, Park thought that this man must have had many regrets in the human world because he had achieved so much in life. Continuing, the man said he had once told the human world his name and wanted everyone to remember him, at least after his death. But now thinking back, it was an unrealized dream from his immature days. While living in the immortal realm, he couldn't stop thinking about the things he lost. He deeply regretted what he hadn't done, but in the end, it was just a part of his past. Mentioning that it was a long speech, the man thanked Park for listening and said that thanks to him, he could enjoy a tour of the human world once again. Meanwhile, in the background, a group of people seemed to be holding a sort of protest, demanding that the Dragon King stop the human sacrifices for that year. Observing the situation, Ryung asked if Park understood what he was seeing. He said he couldn't believe that the country's leader was sacrificing his people. Furious, Ryung declared they should go find the country's leader. However, the protagonist asked them to wait a moment because a sort of black circle was above them, supposing it could be a solar eclipse. But a threatening aura began to envelop the area, and an explosion occurred. Desperate, many people started running for their lives. Amidst the darkness, a man remarked that those beings didn't know their place. Enraged, Park charged at the man, attacking him with a tool from earlier, seemingly defeating him. However, in the background, he heard voices pleading to be saved. At that moment, Park was struck by something, and the person said they didn't expect to find him in a place like that, mentioning that the protagonist was wandering in the wrong world, and for that reason, they would take his life. Sensing the energy, Park said the man was an agent of Mikusha or something similar, thinking he recognized the energy and found it unpleasant, as the woman had felt it ever since the statue was destroyed. Additionally, the man was openly displaying his intention to kill. Park asked if he was perhaps close to the man he had just defeated. Then he said the man could say whatever he wanted because no matter what happened, he would pay for the crimes he had committed in his life. Park, for his part, asked what crimes he had committed, and then he began casting his spell again, which enveloped the entire area, stating that the one who needed to pay for his crimes was him. Immediately, several wooden figures appeared, beginning to approach the man and defeating all of his henchmen. The woman, in turn, asked what they were doing, ordering them to release the phantoms right away as they should tear the man limb from limb. Shortly after, the phantoms, also known as ghosts, were unleashed, moving toward the protagonist. Park thought that he hadn't expected to use this, but he was glad he had bought the short pipe at the market, and he immediately began consuming the drug. As a result, his strength and muscle endurance improved along with his concentration. At that moment, Park grabbed a kind of root, mentioning that he wouldn't miss them at all, and started executing them one by one. However, the woman said it didn't matter how many ghost trees resisted, as it was like poking a rock with a toothpick, demanding to know what her subordinates were doing, and ordering them to release more phantoms to trap the protagonist once and for all. In a matter of seconds, blood started pouring from her mouth, and meanwhile, all her subordinates fell to the ground. As they writhed in agony, they cried out for help from anyone. Park, surprised, observed the situation situation, asking if she really thought he was crazy enough to use a sword against her. Watching the smoke, the woman thought it could be what she was assuming. Then Park said that he used that drug to detoxify his body, but for everyone else, that smoke was extremely toxic, mentioning that this ability was quite terrifying. In her final words, the woman seemed to call out to her father. However, at that very moment, an explosion occurred, and a man asked if the word she had uttered was father, while another man held the first man, asking if she was referring to that person. Observing that young man, the protagonist thought he was the celestial god Makosha. Shortly after, the man threw the other guy to the ground, who asked who were these people doing this to them, questioning if they knew who he was. However, the protagonist's friend said it didn't matter who he was because the point was that he had committed an unforgivable sin against the people. At that moment, the young man started laughing, saying he had been wondering what kind of nonsense they were talking about, asking them to remember that before going to hell. And thanks to his curiosity, he wouldn't let any mortal survive. Park thought he wasn't just absorbing the dead bodies, but also taking their strength, wondering why they were using innocent people for such purposes, mentioning that the man's art was extremely powerful, and he didn't know how he would be able to stop it, wondering if perhaps he should use the nine-tailed fox fan, but he wasn't sure if it would work, yet he had no other choice. The other man said it was an ancient art, and he couldn't believe the blood reincarnation was present in the human world, asking if the protagonist could perhaps lend him his sword. In the middle of that situation, the man seemed to be extremely focused. Then, shortly after, the protagonist handed him the weapon, and he made a cut, managing to split that sphere in half. He said he had no right to punish him for his sins against innocent people, simply because he belonged to the immortal realm. However, the crime of taking the lives of other immortals and making sacrifices for his power was unforgivable, and for that reason, a member of the immortal realm should take responsibility and punish him, beginning to perform a series of cuts on the young man, who in a matter of seconds was killed. As a result of the mortal society's swift action, the terrorists were arrested, and the terrorism suspects were from an organization called Rio Ablem. Meanwhile, that lady seemed to be watching the news. A man was giving his opinion on TV, mentioning that mortal society had done nothing, and in the end had only managed to film the scene. He said they just needed to watch that video, because those two were their former heroes, and the identities of the protagonist and his friend appeared on television. The presenter said that person was extremely familiar, asking if they remembered him, as he was the hero who had appeared a year and a half ago, the one who had decapitated the giant bird from before. Sometime later, that man was apologizing to his lady, mentioning that he wasn't qualified to belong to the immortal realm and whatever punishment was given to him, he would not avoid it. The lady in turn asked Park if after doing all of that, he still dared to look her in the eyes. Then at that moment, the protagonist bowed, apologizing for the inconvenience, thinking that the girl didn't even seem angry. Then the lady asked the man to raise his head, saying she wouldn't claim that his actions were wrong, but rather she was reprimanding him to be more cautious. She told Park to prepare for disciplinary action, and shortly after she dismissed them both. Sometime later, Park seemed to have returned to his garden, feeling as though he had been away from it for days, saying they could finally see it again. Then he grabbed some notes, thinking that he hadn't expected to find what was hidden in the statue from before, mentioning that he didn't think it any special power. Shortly after, the bear appeared on top of his head, asking if that wasn't his handwriting. The protagonist asked if that family had done something wrong to the bear. The spirit, angry, said it was thanks to that family that he was in this form. Meanwhile, Park seemed to be analyzing the scroll, which didn't seem to have anything special about it, thinking that without a doubt, the one who wrote that was certainly King Sejong. In the writing, it said that he knew he didn't have much time left to live, but even so, he wasn't afraid of anything. However, the one thing he feared was seeing his son close his eyes before him, and the rest of his worries were about the people he would leave behind. Seeing that Hayoung was losing weight day by day due to the curse of a deity. That's why he was concerned that after he and his friend died, someone protected by the immortals might seize power over the state, which could lead to that land being covered in the blood and tears of innocent people, because long ago, many lives were lost because of the deities. And before that happened again, the era of immortals treating the human world as a mere plaything. Those who hadn't awakened their spiritual physique would also need power to confront the immortals. There was a distant war in the northwest, and some letters called runes, and it was said that if all were combined, it would reveal their true power, and it functioned like a verse with power within the letters. Therefore, if someone could create a text with them, they could accomplish something incredible. Park said that perhaps he was trying to create a language system similar to the Draco Bone script. The bear said that the cleverness of that child was famous, even in the immortal realm, and if he had lived another year, he would have achieved that. However, the protagonist quickly said that he believed the man had accomplished that feat. Continuing to read the writing said that if anyone was good at reading and writing, then they should just learn how to activate it. That way, anyone could end up using the power of the letters. And his final wish was that those 28 characters would not disappear from the world, so that people could easily achieve their goals. Reading the content of that book, the boy was pleased, congratulating the person who was already dead, stating that the future the great king desired had become a reality. The boy used his abilities, and the wooden blocks began to levitate. The young man was amazed by his attack power, and that all of this was due to the power of words and sounds suited for instructing the people. As they had said, then if you could imagine the words in your mind, then you could use them just by reciting. Then the protagonist said the word burn, and the objects began to catch fire. Park Han-yeol was amazed by what he was seeing, getting excited and continuing to burn the objects. That little bear appeared again, wondering who was making so much noise. Then, startled, he asked why the young man was playing with fire in broad daylight, jumping on the boy's head, asking how someone who couldn't even create fire without him had found a way to create it, and that the boy needed to be careful so the fire wouldn't spread. Park Han-yeol thought about how when he said the word louder, the fire grew stronger, or if the louder he spoke the word, the more it would consume him. Then he fell silent to think about the matter, and concluded that if he could make a long and meaningful word, he could create something more powerful and effective. Park Han-yeol took a deep breath and shouted, telling the sky to lament and cry as much as it wanted, continuing to shout the word sky multiple times. However, nothing happened. The boy, for his part, said that saying that out loud was a bit embarrassing, but then he noticed he wasn't alone. Some beat him, smiled after witnessing the whole situation. Embarrassed, the protagonist asked how long she had been there watching, and the girl, for her part, started making jokes about his training. Then she said it was fine to do that and that she respected it and smiled at the young man, which made him even more embarrassed. After that, Park Han-yeol asked why she had come there, and the girl replied that she had heard he was entering the celestial battle. Then she asked if the protagonist had beaten Choel and commented that he was improving quickly, saying she had gone out a bit to prepare for the battle and found something for the boy, mentioning that she was supposed to be looking after him, but hadn't been doing so lately. But it seemed she didn't need to anymore. Then she tossed something to the boy. Park Han-yeol, for his part, asked what it was, and the girl replied that it was a scripture, and they had asked her to deliver it since he had entered the celestial battle. The boy asked who had made it, and Sunbanim said it had been a sage, the protagonist's father, leaving him completely shocked. Then he became irritated with the girl, asking where she had found this person who claimed to be his father. The girl replies that she had found him in a place called Shenfu. A long time ago, Hwanung descended from the heavens and gave mugwort root to a bear and a tiger who wished to become human. Unlike the tiger who fled, the bear endured eating the root and became the human Unmyo. Together, Hwanung and Unmyo gave birth to Dangan Wangyum and created a new history for Korea. That was the myth most people knew. However, what wasn't remembered within this myth was that Unmyo was not Hwanung's legitimate wife. Hwanung, along with his family, cultivated the sacred tree of life in a place in Korea where the heavens connected with the earth, governing in a place called Shenfu. Stambanim says that the protagonist's father was married to Hwanung's youngest princess and resided in Shenfu. She explains that she had finished her work in Shenfu and was preparing to return when a man approached her, saying that her son was in debt to the palace and would soon be in trouble, so he had written something of vital importance, not saying anything more after that. Park Han-yeol thought his father had abandoned his family and simply fled somewhere. He had squandered the family's fortune for his own pleasure, and the burden of the accumulated debt was distributed to his mother and paternal grandmother. However, his father ignored all the blame, and in the end, his grandmother died for nothing. Park Han-yeol grows serious, thinking that his father had found another family and that his previous family meant nothing to him. Then Stambanim asks him to open the box, as it was truly a valuable item. When he opens the box, the protagonist finds a sealed mystical bamboo fan. The scripture in the form of a fan had been created to tame and seal demonic beasts and evil spirits. A fan with 24 blades is considered of high quality, but a fan with more than 48 blades is considered the best. Yet the fan the boy received had 72 blades, and he wonders why his father gave him something so valuable. The girl mentions that it was useful for absorbing evil spirits if he was interested in using it. Park Han-yeol, for his part, says he would cherish it as he wouldn't find another way to get his hands on something so precious. Stambanim smiles, realizing he wasn't walking an easy path. 8 hours before the competition, the protagonist senses an aura and says it feels like someone is there. Then Diek appears, walking. Surprised, Park Han-yeol asks what he was doing there, and the young man says he came to make a request, because he needed help crafting the Flute of Peace. It's known that the first appearance of the flute was during the unified Silla, but the object had been conceived and created long before. During the era of King Wangado, there was a man whom even the immortals couldn't stop, considered someone perfect. Because of this, the immortals lost their powers, allowing the Water Dragon King to cause a massive natural disaster, leading to the sacrifice of many humans. In search of a solution to respond to the disasters, the three kingdoms temporarily united. Thus, the masters of the kingdoms created a celestial item, the Flute of Peace. However, the item was so powerful that they placed two restrictions on it. The first was that it could not be taken out of the Korean peninsula, and the second was that it could not be used in a way that would harm the people living there. Diek mentions that the item was only used in Silla to defeat the mighty Water Dragon King and then simply disappeared. He then says that he came to the protagonist because he probably knew what was needed to create one, and that's given because of the competition. The guards of the gardens would be reduced, so he planned to take the black jade bamboo from the second garden. But for the new Flute of Peace, they would need the black bamboo no matter what, and Lady Yua might become suspicious. As a consequence, there could be a new conflict with the Dragon Palace. Upon hearing this, Park Hamuel thinks that Diek would likely take full responsibility, and that the reason he wanted to do this was probably because of the protests they had seen in Gwanghwamun. But he realizes that Diek is different from the other immortals. Then he says he will help him, because he also thought about the good of his people, and having someone like him willing to help was a good thing, and that it would be terrible of him not to want to help. Diek is happy and says he was sure the boy would join him. He then says they should leave immediately. Upon arriving at the location, Park Hamuel discovers it's a floating island. His companion explains that it was an artificially created space by the pavilion, so if they alter the structure's formula, they'll be able to enter. But it wouldn't be easy. Diek throws a small wooden horse figurine, which transforms into a beautiful black horse. Diek asks the boy to hold his hand. As they ride through the skies, the young man says he won't let them touch the boy. This statement leaves him confused. However, looking back, he sees that they are being followed by flying sea monsters. Diek drops the young man on the island and says he'll distract them. He then rides off, but Park Hamuel realizes he'll also face problems there. Deciding to ingest the mandrake drug, he recalls that the proper sounds for the instruction of the people, the longer and more meaningful the sentence, the better. He then shouts the word fast and begins to run faster. He senses an unusual energy coming from two places and thinks it would be great if one of them were from the Black Jade Lake. Suddenly, he is attacked by a lizard monster. He dodges. Park is surprised because the creature seems stronger than a celestial immortal. If it had a wood attribute, he'd be at a disadvantage. However, the boy says he has already taken his drug, so it would be hard for them to get past him. The creature is charged toward him. The protagonist shouts the word appear, and a brown bear appears. The lizards try to flee, but the bear continues to chase them. It tells the boy to keep waving his fan. The protagonist thinks it's no wonder he's called the god of the Fire Mountain. Among the great mountains, the evil spirits who command the mountains and have the word evil in their name are rare. And among all of them, there is only one that can control fire naturally. According to legend, people in the past believed that the mountain's fire would spread throughout Seoul, and to prevent that from happening, they created a lake around the mountain, suppressing the fire energy for years. The creatures flee, and the bear asks the boy to help him. Park Hamuel thinks it's strange that they are running right toward that energy. After all, it's probably the Jade Lake that's providing nutrients to this island, given how well the plants grow there. From the top of a tree, the boy sees the lizards fleeing toward a turtle-shaped structure. He wonders if that is the Black Jade Lake, but it seems to be just a stone. Then the little bear asks to be let down there. The boy responds that he's never seen anything like it before, and asks if the bear won't regret it later, to which the animal replies that it's curious. The boy then waves the fan, and the bear returns to being a massive brown bear. As it defeats the lizards, the beast remarks that they are very weak. But from inside the cave, something observes the bear. It then traps the bear in a water bubble, and the bear asks for the protagonist's help. He bursts the bubble using his abilities. Park Hamuel comments that it must be the creature serving as fertilizer for the island. The little bear is surprised to see that there really is a creature inside. The protagonist wonders if the creature is a young hate. If a baby is this size, imagine it as an adult. He's also surprised that it's not a lake. but a divine beast trapped to feed someone's ego, and that the Leaf family. The bear comments that while it may be a baby, it's around 2,000 years old, and seeing it use that technique uncontrollably, it seems like it doesn't know the basics. While holding his fan, Park Han-yeol says it's good for the bear. Frightened, the small animal asks what he's talking about. The boy waves his fan, saying he'll give the bear a jar of honey later to make up for it. He then traps both creatures inside his fan. Inside the item, the creature fights with the brown bear. Park Han-yeol is pleased to see that both fit inside. He closes his fan, saying it's time to leave. While walking with Deuk, a boy thanks him, as they manage to leave safely thanks to his help. The protagonist wonders why Deuk seems so out of breath. He then notices that his companion is bleeding, but Deuk tells him not to worry because he just needs to rest for a while to recover. Still, Park Han-yeol is concerned, knowing they will have to fight in a few hours. Deuk then hands something to the protagonist, explaining that it was a payment for helping him fulfill a difficult task. He elaborates that the item was crafted by twin dragons living in the Garden of Flowers, but that he wished he could give more of his own things. However, this was all he could manage to secure. The boy stays silent, observing the situation. Deuk tells him not to look so solemn, as he deserves much more than just that. Park Han-yeol reflects on how his mission is far from over, since he still needs to create the Flute of Peace, and he thinks that perhaps a situation may arise where they won't be able to escape Yu's grasp. Then the young man helps Deuk walk, suggesting they leave. Deuk smiles, saying he knew the boy wouldn't be prideful. Both leave the place smiling. Park Han-yeol thinks that Deuk is a strong person, both as a divine being and as a human. He promises to become strong enough one day to confidently call him brother. The people begin arriving for the competition. The announcer informs the crowd that they are in Dokdo, in the Eastern Ocean. The fight hasn't even started, but they can already feel the strong energy among the competitors. Next, it's explained that the competition will function similarly to previous ones, where there will only be one winner between two teams. Some are worried that this year's competition isn't balanced because the opponents come from different worlds. Park Han-yeol watches Deuk, thinking about how he didn't even seem injured a few hours ago. Before the competition begins, representatives from each country send a message of greeting to the Water Dragon King, asking for his understanding as the competition will be held in his domain. Then some women prepare to transform part of the waters between the Korean peninsula and Japan. The two islands connect. This is the power of the sages. Thanks to them, the power of the water dragon has synchronized, creating a new space. The higher-ups chose the participants, and they were examined to meet the conditions set by each representative. A masked figure introduces herself as Siva, saying she will judge the competition with fairness and honor. Until a winner is decided, she promises to protect Yua with her life. A second masked figure appears, introducing himself as Odin, also stating that he will judge the competition with fairness and honor. He promises to protect the 7 branches with his life until a victor is chosen. Suddenly, the protagonist's bag begins to glow. The boy thinks that the masked man must be carrying the sword that holds the power of the 7 branches because it is reacting to the axis. The box containing the sword opens. The item seems to come to life. However, Odin contains it, apologizing, explaining that the sword has a competitive spirit and goes mad when it senses a worthy opponent. But it was strange for it to react this way when the sword's owner doesn't even exist. Odin then apologizes for disrupting the competition. Yua comments that if the broken sword carries the divine power of the blacksmith, the man should know the level of that spirit. Park Han-yeol thinks the item must be the broken sword. It was named that way because the blade is so strong that it breaks any other. It's said that it was made from the bones of Valhalla's humans, which were strong and had significant combat power. The young man realizes that the sword's power must have been contained by the masked man. If he hadn't stopped it, the sword might have gone toward him due to its synchronization with his axis. The man must have sensed that someone there had enough power to make the sword react. Next, it is announced that Li Ang will be the first to participate, and he will face a celestial immortal. Someone sits next to the protagonist and says that it's a pity. The person is Go Hyun-hwa. The boy asks, "What's a pity?" The girl replies that if he continues watching, he'll find out, as she hates explaining things. When the protagonist looks at the arena, Li Ang's opponent summons a kamikaze. The weasels charge at the boy, but he blocks the attack and tries to counter the celestial immortal. But before he could attempt anything, Kamidachi returned and managed to strike the boy, leaving the protagonist startled by what he was witnessing. Park Han-yeol thought about how that celestial immortal had adapted and grown stronger within seconds. Go Hyun-hwa smiled and asked if the young man understood, remarking that he was probably wondering how the opponent was winning without using any weapons. However, Even if he didn't win, the boy should at least consider that on the other side, energy itself was also a weapon. This competition also served as a demonstration of the difference between Korean and Japanese abilities, and even the royal family was watching. The secret purpose of the competition was to create a performance that would stay in their memory. It was an opportunity to regain the dignity of the Go family and showcase it to the world. You were one to show the world an image of Koreans defeating the Japanese. At first, Liang was just another piece. However, the boy managed to stand up after the Kamitachi's attacks. Liang had taken severe damage from his opponent's attack. His physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, as the wound inflicted by the Kamitachi caused him to bleed profusely. This prompted the tournament's narrator to question whether the Koreans would lose in the very first match. Then Liang attempted a counterattack, but before he could do anything, he was once again easily struck by the weasels. As a result, the boy was left even more injured and collapsed to the ground, unable to stand any longer. The narrator then announced that the first match ended in a victory for the Japanese. Go Hyun-ho turned to Park Hae-myung, asking if he shouldn't be happy since, thanks to the young man, the Japanese wouldn't have high expectations. She then confidently stated that the boy could win his battle. She explained that they had to be the best in order to stand out. Park Hae-myung stood up and said he would do his best, adding that he was sure he would win. As he entered the arena, the announcer pointed out that the boy had become famous due to Yua and the incident at Gwanghwamun. The same celestial immortal who defeated Liang sneered, saying that another fool was coming his way, remarking how weak these people were. However, Park Hae-myung quickly dashed for the young man, delivering a punch to his face. Everyone watching the fight was stunned by what they had just witnessed. Park Hae-myung had defeated his Japanese opponent with a single blow. Some banners shouted for him to be careful, warning that charging in like that could be dangerous. Deok, however, said that, in his opinion, the young man's move was clean and efficient. The girl questioned whether efficiency meant throwing oneself at the enemy without any defense. How could that be considered a battle technique? But Deok responded that it was indeed a technique, because that's how the protagonist had learned to fight. Park Hae-myung consumed one of his drugs, gaining a vitality boost in his cells and increasing blood production in his body. Boy thought that using it would make him more resilient, but it would be better if he had used something with a hemostatic agent. Another Japanese opponent then entered the ring. Park Hae-myung glared at her with a murderous look, which made the girl nervous, yet she stated that she wouldn't go easy on him. She then summoned giant samurai statues. The boy figured that his opponent was using those to avoid close combat. He clenched his fist. Seeing this, the girl thought he would use the same punch as before, but she was prepared for that. However, one of her statues was grabbed by a wooden giant. The girl realized that the boy could also summon a familiar. The protagonist then declared that he would handle this the Korean way. He decided to use the ability to sounds of power and began with a military sound. He sang a Korean military song. The people wondered why he was singing that. Park Hae-myung recited a verse from the song, which urged them not to fear retreating and to face the enemy, stating that the country's fate was in their hands. After hearing that, the wooden giants attacked one of the samurais. The girl tried to stop it, but the giant's head was crushed. Park Hae-myung smiled, pleased that his plan had worked. Everyone around was amazed by what they had seen, as Park had won 2 matches in a row. The boy reflected that in a fight, he couldn't reveal all his abilities. Otherwise, the next opponent would be aware of his fighting style. Besides, this competition was merely a show to entertain the Yua family and others. Lee had ended up with a humiliating role, sacrificing himself like that, but still he had no intention of playing around there because he would be the main character of that show. The announcer mentioned that 2 Japanese immortal-level opponents had already been defeated, and now there was a match against a pure immortal opponent, so they should see if Park could win again. Observing the man on the battlefield, people speculated that he could be a shinobi. Park, on the other hand, thought that the man's aura was certainly different from that of a celestial immortal, assuming that this was indeed a pure immortal. Quickly, the man threw some kunis at the protagonist, who swiftly summoned his wooden dolls to defend himself. Then, an explosion happened, and once again that man attacked the boy, who barely managed to dodge the attack. However, those kunis exploded again, throwing the boy into the air. The man about to strike again was met by Park, casting a spell to avoid the attack, saying that the man had almost sliced him in half. Because of that, he needed to respond with much more strength, casting a spell at the shinobi. Irritated, the bear said that the protagonist had left him alone with the man, but Park only smiled. He asked who that shinobi was and why he wanted to face the boy, but the protagonist said he'd explain the details later. Looking at the man's clothes, he noticed that he bore the crest of the Suzuki clan, and few people wore the pride of the three-legged crow. For that reason, the bear said he would take out his anger on the shinobi instead of the protagonist. Mentioning that a pure immortal was no match for him, he began launching a series of attacks at the shinobi, whose armor seemed to be melting. Satisfied, the bear remarked that if things continued like this, he could win easily. Attempting to land his final blow, the bear said he would end the fight, but at that moment, Park asked him to wait. And in a matter of seconds, something strange started to happen, because that melted armor began to move toward the bear. It wasn't steel armor, but rather magic, using malleable steel. Calling out for help from the protagonist, the bear said he needed cold energy. At that moment, the boy seemed to have an idea, saying he would help and soon send cold energy to him. Observing this, the spirit remarked that the energy felt familiar, appearing surprised by something. Suddenly, a gigantic spirit was standing before him. The bear, desperate, asked who had sent that spirit there, begging it to release him. The announcers watching the scene were utterly shocked, mentioning that the protagonist's technique was lighting up the entire area. Shortly after, the shinobi appeared in tears, staring intensely at Park, thinking that it should be enough, as losing was already humiliating, and the man seemed tired. He was probably going to surrender. However, it wasn't the shinobi who spoke, but a woman beside him. An intimidating aura began to surround the woman, who said it was just a fight, and to be precise, an event created peacefully between both sides. Therefore, she didn't think they needed to risk the lives of two talents over this. Park, observing the situation, remained silent. Meanwhile, the two of the young man's companions watched the scene. The protagonist thought that this meant he was someone who couldn't die there, mentioning that the man was someone sick, as she had lent to the sanctuary. Then the lady said she felt ashamed, as she had felt pity for one of the participants, and thus had interfered in the fight between them. For that reason, they had the right to withdraw their participant from the fight. Observing this, Park seemed surprised. Yua, thanking them for their efforts, stated that the young man had won 3 times in a row. Because of this, she couldn't imagine he possessed such incredible skills and items. Park thought that even if she tried to compliment him, it was still quite humiliating, saying he could have done much better if he had been notified of the event earlier. The woman, on the other hand, asked what he was talking about. Park then said that, thanks to her, perhaps he had gained more attention from the mortals, asking if she thought that, as an awakened one, they were just a bunch of idiots. Meanwhile, that shinobi, with a threatening look, watched the situation. Looking at the man, Park thought he felt sorry for him. Shortly after, he met up with another girl who said he had done a good job, mentioning that it was a shame, but the protagonist said it was fine. However, the girl clarified that she wasn't talking about Park, because on artist shows, people like him were called producers, since even though they had skills, they could be discarded in seconds. Park did his best and could have done much more, but it was better for the image of that boy because Park plastically gave up with him. The protagonist thinks that if this were soccer, it would be like taking out a strong player who would definitely win the game. However, he was certain that the audience wouldn't celebrate this decision, given the drama that had unfolded so far. So the boy says he didn't think she knew about those things. And she responds that you don't see much of that nowadays, but people talk a lot about it on social media, asking if it was strange to follow the world's trends. Park says it was strange, but respected her nonetheless. Meanwhile, the announcer began to introduce the next participants, but at that moment the ground started to shake and a tsunami began to form. Above it, a man asked where the traitors who had disrespected his palace were. Seeing the situation, the protagonist didn't know what they were talking about, and the other girl said they were the sons of the dragon king of water. The other man then said he didn't want to hear any excuses because they dared to disrespect the dragon's laws, asking if they thought he wouldn't notice they were using the competition for hidden purposes, since the real goal was to exchange treasures away from the palace's eyes. So they would be kind if they handed over the traitors, but he wouldn't fail to deliver his father's message. He demanded they return the 7-branched sword's access they were carrying, and if they showed sincerity and offered apologies, his father might forgive them and return the items they brought to that place. However, those around seemed to disagree with all of it, so the man asked if that was their decision. Grabbing his weapon, he began to prepare for an attack, saying that all of them would be swallowed by the ocean and cast into the 7 seas, starting to unleash the ocean that had been contained. Park, watching this unfold, thought that everything had happened very suddenly, but he needed to take advantage of the situation and merge the axis with his sword. Soon after, he seemed to find the person he was looking for, thinking that if he could make the resonance between the two like before, it might work. But at that moment, a water dragon began to envelope the area. Submerged in the water, the protagonist thought that if things continued like this, he wouldn't be able to make it, so he had no choice but to do it. He began to draw a magic sword, feeling pleased that it worked. He quickly managed to escape the water. However, he ended up plunging back into the ocean. Thinking he didn't expect to be thrown back into the water again, he realized he needed to get out of that place soon. At that moment, a glow began to envelop the area because the protagonist's sword seemed different. Park thought it was one of the strongest energies he had ever seen in his life, wondering if it was by chance the golden aura from the axis. It was probably because it had been held and sealed before, and that's why it had such overwhelming energy. Wondering if it wasn't too much energy because it was even pushing his own energy. Because of that, it was too much power, and if it continued like that, his body wouldn't be able to withstand it, so he had to release the energy. However, he was shocked, thinking he had only struck once and already caused damage to space-time. He was surprised because that magic seemed to be trying to engulf him, beginning to fall in that place. Sometime later, the protagonist ended up falling into an unfamiliar location. Looking around, he was astonished, wondering where he was. He supposed it was the space-time created due to the enormous power of that sword. It was worse than the garden gates that led to an entirely different dimension. Wondering if by striking another blow, he could return to the same place as before, but it was better to explore a bit before trying that. However, at that moment, he was struck by something. Before him, an unknown person was walking. Observing the man, Park seemed to recognize him, supposing it was that shinobi from earlier, thinking that the boy had been so enraged before that he had followed him to this place. Soon after, the boy stepped on the protagonist, saying there were more tools in the world than he imagined, but at least he would let Park choose which one he would use. The protagonist, in turn, said he didn't know how to speak Japanese, so the boy told him to choose the tool for himself. Shortly after, a plan appeared beside Park. Pulling the plan out, the shinobi asked what Park was doing, calling him a weak coward. Even though he had won those battles, he hadn't done anything but send his spirits to fight in his place. Asking if Park thought he could do something with earth magic, the shinobi still intended to make the protagonist swallow his words. Park then asked what he was talking about. Right after, that plant transformed into something different. The shinobi seemed to start having hallucinations, eventually falling to the ground. Park told him he couldn't just touch anything he saw. But at that moment, blood began to gush from the shinobi's mouth, and soon after, he collapsed to the ground. Park said that he had managed to kill the shinobi, but even so, that was all there was to it. Shortly after, another person appeared, calling Park an idiot. Then the bear in human form said that every time he showed up, Park was completely wrecked. The bear mentioned that everything was fine and that Park just needed to use an elixir to recover, like he always did. However, the protagonist said that he could tell just by looking at his face and asked him to be honest with him. The spirit said it looked like that had been a critical blow to one of his kidneys. Park thought it felt like his energy was draining out of his body, and if things continued like that, he could lose all his energy, and not only that, but also his life. The spirit reminded him once again that he didn't need to endure everything alone. The bear mentioned that Diak had helped him before, and for that reason, Park should be fine since his core contained the energy of a supreme immortal, and the power Diak had given him still existed, even before his transformation. The bear affirmed that Park had the dragon's blessing, a power that almost no one had, capable of even injuring divine and celestial beings. He questioned if the young man, who hadn't even lived for 100 years, already wanted to die. He added that it would be better for Park to be eaten by a bear than to die lying like a sack of potatoes. The bear doubted that Diak would want the protagonist to die in such a humiliating way. Shortly after, the protagonist apologized for everything. Then he began to fade away. Meanwhile, Yuo was ordering one of her servants to leave that place, thinking that eventually she would kill him. She believed that those people knew absolutely nothing, that they must be savages, because the East Sea was her territory. Yua mentioned that they didn't even appreciate her kindness in getting rid of that man, and now they were raising their blades against her. Recalling the words of that man, the girl thought the Dragon King wouldn't ruin his celestial battle with such an absurd lie. She wondered where that old serpent had heard such things. He was trying to create a hero amid that celestial battle, even though her plan to be worshipped by humans had failed. It wasn't completely in vain. For that reason, they should wait and see what would happen. That way soon, all the heads of the Bastern Sea would be brought to her. Meanwhile, the protagonist was waking up, wondering how long he had been asleep. As he checked how his energy was flowing, he noted that his lower core should recover soon. As he regained consciousness, Park wondered what was going on. He questioned why there were horns on his forehead, and his senses seemed much sharper. But either way, not much time should have passed since the incident. He remarked that his body felt cleaner than he had expected. Looking around, he supposed someone had been taking care of him. He guessed it might have been the bear along with Sunbi, wondering if he was still in the same place because he had consumed the magic pearl using the bamboo fan, creating that barrier. For that reason, Sunbi might have been taking risks to take care of him. Opening a door, Park went searching for that girl, and then he was surprised by what he saw. He wondered how that place had turned into a forest. He had built a shield there using his plants, but now the trees had grown immensely, leading him to suppose that a lot of time had passed. Looking to the side, he noticed that beyond the barrier, there was only destruction. He thought that those traces must have been left from a fight involving that girl. He wondered where she was. At that moment, he heard a noise. Quickly, he went to see where it was coming from. However, he was surprised. He noticed a house in the middle of that place. In front of him, a blue creature was lurking, and he realized it was his spirit. He remarked that it had grown significantly. Park asked why his spirit was so afraid of him, supposing it might be because of the horns. Then the spirit lunged at Park. However, Park easily dodged, telling the creature that it shouldn't bite its owner. At that moment, the creature seemed to realize that it was indeed its master, completely stopping the confrontation. Park remarked that it was very cute, mentioning that there wasn't much change in its energy even after eating the magic pearl, probably because it was using its strength to recover its inner core. Looking around, Park was surprised, noticing that his clothes were lying there. He wondered if there was something he could use. Additionally, he spotted a scroll. Reading it, Park questioned if it was written in Japanese, assuming it was one of those scrolls written by shinobi. According to what the spirit had said during the competition, the crow crest of the Suzuki clan was one of Yagarasu's secrets. He speculated that these were the shinobi's clothes, wondering if they were the kind that had the ability to transform, since it was quite interesting just to wear them. Shortly after, the young man seemed to notice something, wondering what it was. He sensed that it was coming from the same place that had traces of a battle. Observing a group, Park wondered what they were doing since they were trying to break through the barrier. Noticing the color of their hair and their attire, he wondered if they were from that place. However, he was shocked by what he saw, thinking that it looked just like the goblin club that Wanok had given him last time. Because it was so familiar, he realized they were a group of goblins. He didn't think there would be goblins in the space created by the seven-branched sword, guessing that this was their habitat. He wondered if they were trying to invade his territory. Seeing that the goblins were breaking through, the protagonist said he had to stop them. However, he was surprised by what he saw next. Behind those monsters, a person appeared. They asked who the boy was. However, it was Park standing before them. He asked which of the monsters was in command. Showing respect, the commander introduced himself as Tu, asking to be taken to the owner of the sword. However, the protagonist didn't understand what he was talking about, asking what he wanted with the owner of the sword. The goblin mourned that not just anyone could go to that place. Only the sword's owner could do that. If Park didn't tell him where the owner was, he would surely kill the boy. However, Park said he couldn't tell him. He asked how he was supposed to say anything if the goblin didn't explain what he wanted with the man. The goblin said he wanted to find the man and punish him. Their king had made a promise that a man worthy of owning the place would come with a sword, but that man had never shown up. Park thought that he didn't know what was going on, but it seemed the seven-branch sword had some connection to that place. Frustrated, the goblin said they had waited too long for the promise to be fulfilled. Their leader passed it down from one generation to the next, and they had grown tired of waiting. That wretched man who was worthy of the sword deserved to be punished. The goblin demanded to be taken to him right then, threatening to cut off Park's head if he didn't comply. Park, observing the situation, remained silent. He then asked if the goblin had seen a red bear wandering around. The goblin responded that if it was what he was thinking, he had told it to undo the barrier, but it hadn't obeyed, and since this was their world, they had imprisoned it in one of their facilities. Park grew very angry upon hearing this, but he knew he had to stay calm. At least now he knew where the bear was. He told the goblin that he was, in fact, the owner of the sword. However, the goblin called him a liar, saying that if Park wanted to get beaten up, he should just say so. Park was completely shocked by what the monster had said. The monster began hurling insults, claiming Park was too small and looked like someone who had never fought a day in his life. Embarrassed, the protagonist muttered that they were complete idiots. The monster then told Park that if he wasn't going to break the barrier for them, he should leave because they wouldn't kill him if he didn't get in their way. Grabbing his magic weapon, the protagonist grew increasingly angry, stating that they were underestimating him. He prepared to attack, ordering his spirit to spit at them. The monster, shocked by what had just happened, panicked and started to flee. In a matter of seconds, they were completely defeated. Park told them that if they continued acting like that, he would make them spit out more red beans. The The group begged for him not to do that. The protagonist, impressed, thought that those creatures really hated red beans. He asked if their leader was strong. The goblin replied that she was mentioning that she wielded a staff like no one else. Park, however, questioned if merely knowing how to use his staff was enough to be strong. He demanded more information. The goblin added that there was one more thing. She had a golden treasure. Suddenly, a voice interrupted, saying that the protagonist didn't need to know that. Above them, a figure with scarlet hair appeared. She scolded the goblins, calling them idiots for trusting just anyone like that. Seeing the woman, Park assumed she was the goblin's leader. She berated her subordinates for forcing her to come there and questioned how they could be so foolish, warning that this time they'd spend 10 years trapped in that place, seemingly transporting them into a divine item. Observing the scene, Park surmised that the item was the treasure the goblins had mentioned, and since she was their leader, she was probably very powerful. Because of this, he thought it best to start with his red bean attack. He launched an attack at the leader, but she dodged it swiftly. She praised the attempt, noting that it might have worked on her subordinates, but not on her. She commanded her spirits to emerge from the artifact. Park was surprised by her abilities, realizing she was stronger than he anticipated. He knew he had to be careful. He prepared another skill and ordered his spirit to attack her. A massive battle ensued. The goblin leader asked what Park thought of her skill, as it had been a long time since she had this much fun. Park, deep in thought, remained silent, recalling a memory from his past where someone claimed that a staff like hers could achieve anything, but now it seemed like a lie. The bear spirit remarked that it was called a goblin staff, capable of anything they could imagine. Since goblins weren't great thinkers, they relied on their instincts and had no strategy. Additionally, they had excellent physical abilities thanks to their strong bones. Despite their simplicity, if they wanted, they could easily dominate the world. Returning to the present, Park wondered if the goblin leader's level of imagination was superior to the other fools he had encountered earlier, noting that she didn't seem to fear his red beans. He questioned what he could do in this situation. Glancing at the barrier, he thought it could work in his favor, but at that moment, the goblin leader asked what he was staring at, attacking him. Park barely managed to block her strike. She questioned why he was paying attention to anything else besides her in the middle of their battle. As he cut off her attack, Park stayed silent, quickly counterattacking her from behind, though she narrowly avoided it. The leader began summoning her spirits again, successfully hitting the protagonist. An explosion occurred, and Park was thrown to the ground. The leader asked if he had reached his limit and if they should finish things now. She said he should start begging for mercy. She ordered all of her spirits to attack him, thinking that once the fool screamed, she would trap him along with that bear. However, Park regained his strength, claiming that he who laughs last laughs best. He summoned wooden golems, each holding jars of red beans. They poured the beans onto the goblin leader, leaving her completely shocked. But the artifact she wielded seemed to absorb everything. Park remarked that she had been waiting for him to scream, but she had made a huge mistake. He grabbed the artifact and ordered the bear to come out. Immediately, the spirit emerged, saying it knew the protagonist would rescue it. However, it scolded Park for being an idiot and leaving it trapped long enough to feel sad. Park asked if the bear had any idea how long it had been trapped there. The bear said over 150 days had passed. Time worked a bit differently in that world, but wasn't drastically different. Park suggested that if that was the case, the best thing to do was to get out of there quickly. He then freed the goblins trapped inside the artifact, questioning whether the woman was truly the leader of that place. Observing the protagonist, the goblin woman mentioned that he was short with broad shoulders, leaving the young man completely embarrassed by her remark, and he responded that he was of average height. The goblin then said that size didn't matter, and her mother had told her the same. At first, she thought it didn't make sense because Park had bested her in battle. Looking at him, the woman said he seemed smart and wasn't unattractive, so she had made up her mind. She asked the protagonist to marry her, leaving Park completely stunned by what he had heard. The spirit, amidst the situation, wondered if Park might actually get married and questioned how they would even formalize it, considering if everything would turn out fine. Confused, Park asked what she was talking about. The bear, meanwhile, asked if he hadn't yet realized that the goblins were connected to the seven-branched sword. Recalling the prophecy that the man had mentioned, Park thought this might be about that promise. A man would someday come with a certain type of sword. He supposed they were waiting for a man worthy of marrying her. However, Park said it had nothing to do with him, and the person who was supposed to come with the seven-branched sword was probably already dead. But the bear said that wasn't how the woman thought about it. Park figured he was too young, and this had to be a dream, so he needed to wake up quickly from it. He asked the woman where she had hidden the sword and threatened to make her eat so many red beans that her belly would burst if she didn't tell him. He ordered her to speak immediately, but the woman refused to reveal anything and wouldn't give the sword to the protagonist until she had given birth to 3 children with him. Park quickly ordered that they give her more red beans. The bear, watching the situation, remarked that he probably wouldn't get anything out of her that way. However, Park noted that goblins were incredibly stubborn, and it would be difficult to make them talk like this. So the bear questioned why Park didn't just marry her right away. They had been stuck in that place for a long time and probably didn't understand things properly, so Park should realize that he couldn't force them into anything. Besides, that artifact was their greatest treasure. The bear suggested that since time passed differently in that place compared to the real world, maybe Park should marry her and stay there for a while. Looking at the situation, Park thought that if he continued this way, he wouldn't get anywhere. Instead of intimidating her, he thought of bribing them. A little later, the goblin woman seemed to be waking up. She found herself tied up, and in front of her was a bit of food. At that moment, the protagonist noticed she had woken up. Once again, the woman declared that she wouldn't say anything until he married her, but Park replied that it didn't make a difference. He told her to think about what she wanted while he enjoyed the food. He mentioned how delicious the rice cakes were. Watching him eat, the goblin woman's desire for the food grew immense, and she admitted she wanted a piece too. Park threw one into her mouth, and she was immediately enchanted by the taste. She begged for another piece. With a mischievous look, a protagonist watched as she started devouring them all at once. The goblin then said that he shouldn't think this would make her agree to marry him just because of it. She still insisted that they had to have 3 children together. As she chewed the food, the protagonist mentioned there were only 2 rice cakes left. Tears welled up in the goblin's eyes as she pleaded for just one more. Then Park picked up another rice cake, leaving just one. He began to eat it, leaving the goblin completely disheartened, as she muttered that she just wanted to marry someone. Park said they could marry whenever they wanted, but he couldn't marry her at that moment. In disbelief, the woman said he wouldn't do this and accused him of planning to say he'd marry her in 100 years, which was far too long for her. Offering her another plate, Park said he'd give it to her. He mentioned that he could even teach her how to make that kind of food herself. Holding her meal, the goblin woman seemed to accept the young man's offer. Amidst the situation, Park thought that he wouldn't mind marrying when he was 120 years old. A little while later, the goblin performed a spell to reveal a mysterious chest. Park asked if it was a treasure chest, and the goblin replied that she didn't know as her mother had only given it to her. She then started searching for something. After finding it, she handed it to the protagonist, telling him to take it. She mentioned that it would be a token of their engagement. Park asked when it was, and the woman responded that they were seeds. Confused, the protagonist wondered what he could do with them. He quickly became surprised. Nowadays, people no longer cared much about the stories of the Decobes. They only wanted to be remarkable, and if they got hold of something like that. However, goblins, for example, are honest about their possessive desires. They don't hold on to things, trading items and talents freely among themselves, but someone with valuable talents wouldn't part with them so easily. This often led to even more complicated situations. For that reason, negotiating with goblins by offering something they excelled at was the easiest way to get out of a situation like this. Taking the seed, the bear mentioned that it must be valuable in some way, asking the young man to inquire more about it from the goblin. Park wondered if he could keep something as good as that. He called the goblin, who affectionately referred to him as Love. Park then asked if those seeds came from a particular place. The woman responded that her grandmother had taken them from her world before coming to that place. She explained that the former owner of the seed was one of the ministers, as she had mentioned. He was famous for cultivating herbs and medicinal plants and had traveled between worlds. However, he was forced to treat an incurable illness one day and ended up imprisoned, dying of starvation. So he gave the seed to her grandmother in exchange for hiding the rest of his family. Park asked if he had been a herbalist. Reflecting, Park thought that the book he had been trying to decipher to create medicine was likely his. The goblin added that the man had worked for an extremely powerful figure. He wielded a sword and rode a horse, and people said his arrogance had pierced the heavens, leading to his eventual downfall. She asked if there had been a war at the time and things had turned bad. As a result, he gave the seed to her grandmother to remove his family from the battlefield. Park asked if that madman had dragged his family into war, and the woman confirmed it. He didn't want to suffer from their loss, so one could imagine what kind of man he was. Park reflected on the word loss. He thought it was even more disappointing than the suffering itself. The woman stood up, asking if they could continue. Park, observing the situation, urged her to calm down. Afterward, the woman took up her staff again. She began attacking the protagonist. Surprisingly, Park felt no pain at all. However, the woman said she was infusing something into him. Park mentioned that he wasn't feeling anything different. The goblin told him to relax, assuring him that he would eventually figure out how to use it to his advantage. Looking at the chest, Park thought that now all he needed was the 7-branched sword. Opening the box, he found the sacred sword inside. The bear remarked that swords of that level usually stored a lot of energy, but this one seemed quite different. Since its basic attribute was wood, there was no reason for Park to hesitate. Park replied that the contradiction of wood was precisely the earth. Even so, the bear insisted that no matter what happened, Park shouldn't stop. Seeing the energy, the bear urged him to go ahead with it anyway. At that moment, Park grabbed the sword, and a giant beam of light enveloped him. He appeared to struggle with controlling the sword. The bear warned him not to let go of the sword under any circumstances. Park, irritated, asked if the bear thought he couldn't handle the immense power of the sword. The bear, astonished by what he was witnessing, mentioned that it was the first time he had seen Park like that, as the energy was now emanating even more powerfully. Right after that, the sword seemed to calm down. The bear says that it was incredible, and it was as if he were watching the spirit of an elite general guiding the sword along with him. That's why he knew that the seven-branched sword was amazing. Park, on the other hand, thinks that he acted on instinct when he grabbed the sword, and it felt like he had been using it for a long time, assuming that must be the talent she had given him. He then asks the goblin if she wanted to get married at that moment. The scene then cuts to the protagonist's world city. That cheerful spirit mentions that it was very enjoyable. Park, on the other hand, thinks that it had been a long time since he had been to Korea. The protagonist wanted to have his spirit before, but during the fight against the goblin leader, he ended up using too much energy, so he came to the nearest city since he couldn't make it to Bear Mountain. Thinking that the goblin wanted to go with him, however, she was still very irresponsible, mentioning that it had been 7 months since his competition, and still many people were talking about it. Furthermore, since that incident, the driving king of the East Sea had not returned yet. Civilians and reporters started criticizing the invasion of the East Sea people without a valid reason, and they also began criticizing the 3 princesses of Korea for not saying a single word. However, a month later, the Dragon King appeared, apologizing, saying that it had been a mistake and a failure in the communication of the information received. But even so, no one was able to forgive either of the powers yet. The bear, on the other hand, asked what had happened to the dragons of the West and South Seas. Then Park responds that he didn't want to get involved in that situation, as they might not have been on the side of the East Sea. The spirit, on the other hand, asserts that it was quite obvious, as they just wanted to cause a commotion for no reason. The relationship between the dragons wasn't very good, but they had once united when there was a war between humans and mortals. Observing that situation, the protagonist thinks that there was still a problem, wondering where the 7-branched sword was. And the only thing they knew was that the protector of the sword had notified the Nordic Administrative Council to stay in Korea and participate in the subjugation of the East Sea, thinking that this must be happening because he ended up grabbing it and going to another dimension, mentioning that the man was extremely strong and that he had a connection to that sword. Knowing that someone like him was looking for it made him even more anxious about finding his sword again. Then the bear responds that the East Sea had been really foolish, as even humans were starting to look at them with anger. Shortly after, a message informs that their time using the system had ended, thanking them for their preference. The bear, in turn, asks the young man what they were going to do next, and he responds that they had to go to Wanak Mountain. He was sure that he was on the list of missing or dead persons, and if he appeared out of nowhere, the garden would become very suspicious of it. For that reason, he's going to stay quiet and wait for the dust to settle while he watches the situation. Then the bear says that when they get there, he's going to take a look at his original body, as it had been a long time since he had felt its energy. That happened right after entering the dimension of those goblins, and he thought he would feel it again when he returned to that world. However, he felt nothing, and that's why he was becoming concerned. Surprised, Park wonders if it had been 7 months since the bear had felt energy in his body, asking if that wasn't too serious, and for that reason, they should leave immediately. And because of that, they head to the mountain at that moment. Sometime later, the two already seemed to be near the destined place, completely surprised by what they had seen, as that tree had grown absurdly, and with it, there were beehives. Surprised, Park wonders how those bees could penetrate that barrier. However, the bear says that everything was fine, as sometimes one insect or another could end up getting in. Observing a branch of leaves, the protagonist questions what that was. Then the bear seems to be in disbelief at what he had seen, as under that place another bear was resting. The bear, in turn, is surprised, mentioning that his original body was very strange, and for that reason, he didn't know what was happening. Shortly after, those bees seem to start attacking the two of them, so Park quickly pulls out his scroll along with his artifact, which begins to summon all his spirits. Ordering his spirits to attack those bees, a battle with them begins. However, for Park, there were too many of those bees, and he thought they were very difficult to kill, even using his abilities, and for that reason, he needed something stronger. Then, shortly after, the bear ends up awakening his true form and begins to charge at those bees. Park, in turn, asks him to wait, but the spirit says that he could let him take care of all of them with his fire, and if it weren't for their hive, he would have attacked with all his strength. But he couldn't hurt the tree, as it was simply infested with those bees, wondering if there was any other way to get everything off that tree. Park, on the other hand, ponders over a situation that might work. While watching those bees on the ground, assuming that they had not been killed even after being attacked, and in the same moment, he seems to have an idea about a good plan. Immediately, Park asks the bear to wait for a moment, asking him to step aside, and right after, he seems to throw something in front of those bees, which are then defeated, and as a consequence, they end up fleeing from the tree, crashing into those barriers. Observing that situation, the protagonist feels relieved, mentioning that he had managed to set up that barrier. Surprised, the bear says he didn't know how those bees ended up in that place. It was just a guess, but there was a story that, in the past, the Queen of the West built something called Golden Peak on a mountain, but it had been a long time since she appeared, and the Queen of the West was the goddess from Chinese mythology, considered a fairy and possessed potions of immortality. Pointing to the tree, the protagonist asks if he was saying that because of what had happened, mentioning that a long time ago, some bees were traveling, and when looking for an area to settle, they smelled that place, and for that reason, settled in the tree. Standing up, the young man assumes that all the bees were already dead. The smoke inside the barrier had already disappeared, asking the spirit if they should take a look. Shortly after, they seemed to approach the tree, opening a hive that was filled with honey, saying that it was not ordinary as it was clear that it had pure energy in it, stating that they could even preserve it. Park, in turn, questions whether it would be possible to make a stock of honey in that place, assuming that he could use it somehow to make an extremely powerful elixir. Observing those honeycombs, he ends up finding bee larvae, mentioning that they still seem to be alive inside that hive, and if he wasn't mistaken, had many nutrients that helped them grow. Beginning to taste them, he mentions that he wanted to know if that was true. Shortly after, the system announces that a drug has been consumed, and the property of the drug was called royal jelly, which, as a result, stimulates the protagonist's growth. The protagonist says that thinking that the larvae had honey, he had assumed it would be sweeter. Observing the protagonist, the bear seems surprised, asking why his head was glowing. Noticing the young man's horns, the bear assumes he was the son of a dragon. Completely shaken, the bear questions what was happening, and Park responds that it must be because of the draconic power he had consumed. But for the bear, that didn't make sense, asking how he was taking on dragon characteristics as if he had been born one. Then Park replies that lately only strange things have been happening, and he saw what he was wearing before. Observing that scar, the spirit mentions that it was really strange, questioning if the young man was okay. Park asks if he knew what was happening, to which the bear replies that he didn't know anything about it. A dragon is born with the power of water offered by nature, and thus they practice martial arts, accumulating this power for thousands of years. And for that reason, they are an extremely legendary existence, but humans are completely different from dragons because they can use more elements of nature. So in the case of someone being both human and draconic, they could become practically invisible. For this reason, Park could end up becoming a monster that had never existed on the face of the earth, mentioning that it must be hard to bear all that power inside him. However, Park responds that he still hasn't fully developed, and because of that, it would be harder to manage. The bear says that seeing his core receive the power, his horns started to grow. For this reason, he could end up becoming a complete dragon after consuming more energy. But since he was human, he could still suffer some side effects as a consequence. Moreover, if he became a dragon, he might end up being forced to live in the water. Immediately after, our boy begins to ponder over the possibility of becoming a dragon, thinking that as his horns began to grow, it meant that he could consume the power of water. And if he left the larva there without any issues, they could end up turning into new bees, and then produce more honey and many more larvae for him. For that reason, he could take incredible advantage of that. Shortly after, our boy responds that he wanted to learn to use his power better, because thanks to the pill that woman had given him, his power didn't go out of control, and he was able to drastically increase his energy. Since the elixir had the wood attribute, it was like a light at the end of the tunnel for him, asking what the correlation and contradiction of his elements were, because some elixirs he used were ineffective, and it was probably because of his wood element. For that reason, if he used one that contradicted wood, he would probably be able to use the other properties without suffering too many negative effects. Then the bear mentions that it seemed like a good idea, asking what exactly he wanted to learn. He responds that he could try using that, pulling out various notes that were in his backpack, mentioning that they were books left by the disciple of the celestial wolf, and another was a scroll from that shinobi's family from earlier. He didn't have much to do in that place, and for that reason, he thought it would be fun to learn that kind of thing. Picking up a scroll, he mentions that he found it very interesting, stating that he wanted to learn that shinobi's technique, and with his 7-branched sword, he could already use 3 legendary items he possessed. Then the bear responds that he had good items and a good plan, and all he needed to do now was train and not attract too much attention. Shortly after, the protagonist responds that there was still something bothering him, mentioning that he hadn't yet delivered the black jade to his brother Dioki. However, the bear asks why he hadn't given the sprout to him in one of the many times, and still didn't understand why he cared so much about giving it to the young man, mentioning that the boy was a very intelligent person, but he still needed to see the world in a broader way, and he knew that he wanted to make a flute with the jade sprout, asking if he really thought he would be able to do that, and he bet he wasn't sure that such a threatening item could be functional. Calling the protagonist a fool, he states that he knew someone who would make that item and was sure he would succeed. Surprised, Park asks if he knew someone capable of forging a flute. Then the bear responds that even if he did, he wouldn't even think about giving it to Dioki. But the protagonist asks him to relax as he was also very interested in that flute. The bear in turn questions if he wasn't lying about that, and the boy responds that he wasn't, as he would deliver it to Dioki's brother, thinking that it wouldn't make much difference whether he delivered it or used it in the end. Accepting the protagonist's offer, the bear says they would go to that place immediately, and the blacksmith he was going to introduce was known as the God of Fire. A long time ago, he settled his debt with his nephew and sister, and for that reason, they were heading to Mount Kua at that moment. Park in turn asks where that was, and the bear responds that maybe he didn't know because it was in North Korea. Park in turn is completely surprised, asking if the bear was by any chance North Korean, and moreover, the boy had a sister. However, the bear says he wasn't who he was thinking of, because that mountain he named after his sister wasn't the same as that other mountain. After all, he wasn't the spirit of that place. However, his nephew was called Dangan, and according to the lady in the North Korean peninsula, there were 3 great powers that country, and it seemed that the bear's sister was in Azadal on Mount Kua. Sometime later, the protagonist along with the bear seems to arrive at their destined place. Park in turn was completely in disbelief as they were really in North Korea. But in any case, they say that place is one of the most powerful in the entire North Korean nation, asking why he couldn't see it anywhere. The bear, returning to his human form, asks him not to stray too far from him. Park mentions that it seemed like they were still very far away, and the spirit responds that they had already arrived at the location. Observing something, our boy seems very surprised because in front of him were 2 giant statues that start to speak, asking who they were as Azadal didn't allow the entry of visitors who were not invited. Shortly after, the spirit tells him to say that the red bear from Mount Guanak had come to see them. Then the statue asks them to wait a minute, and the bear responds that he had brought them a snack. Park in turn is impressed, thinking that they became so apprehensive when they learned it was the spirit, and now seeing him, he truly seemed to be of nobility, but even so, he still hadn't grasped the essence of that place. At that moment, our boy seems to start falling to the ground, mentioning that he felt a bit dizzy, completely surprised by what he had seen, as a gigantic city was in front of him, mentioning that they were using magic to hide the village, wondering how so many people were living in that place. The bear responds that not everyone there was as good a person as him, and that's why before they hid in the Azadal of the human world, they selected the people who deserved to live in that place. There was a rule that everything in the right to live or die belonged to his nephew, who in the end allowed many to live in that place. Park in turn thinks they could say he was similar to the great leader of paradise on Earth in the north. Then a group of people seems to approach the protagonist, and the man mentions that the leader wished to see the spirit, who quickly asks who the leader was at that moment. The man responds that it was the Great Mother who was waiting at the main house, asking who his companion was. He responds that it was his subordinate and a child of his trust. Accepting what the spirit had said, the man asks them to follow him, and sometime later they all seem to be walking together to the destined location. While Park was apparently blindfolded, the man mentions that they had arrived at the place. Park, still blindfolded, assumes that this was the main house of that place. He mentions that there was such a beautiful palace in that place. However, the place seemed strange. Then a girl was standing before him, whose name was Anju, mentioning that she seemed completely different from her lady. Next, the girl thanks them for their hard work, apologizing if she was bothering them with her request. Shortly after, that man leaves, and only the protagonist and his spirit remain beside that woman, mentioning that it had been a long time since they had seen each other, and she truly missed him a lot. Starting to hug the boy, who was now in his human form, stating that her brother hadn't changed a bit since he disappeared, and hadn't sent any news during that time, which is why she had been so worried. With a threatening tone, she says, "You must be tired from walking all the way to that place, and for that reason, should get some rest. Shortly after, the protagonist seems to understand the situation. Then the girl responds not to worry about it, as it was temporary. The girl in turn asks if he was afraid of her, as she was the only family he had left since they were still beasts living in forests. However, she was still very curious about him, asking why a dragon was there coming as a subordinate of her brother. Shortly after, the protagonist removes his mask and says it would be easier to call him a monster. Sometime later, they both sit down to talk, and Park Han-yu tells the story of how they got there. Anju in turn says she understood, but it was still strange as the whole story seemed too exaggerated, and she then questions if the boy was trying to deceive her. The young man responds that wasn't what he was doing, and that it was precisely because Wanak trusted him that he had been brought along. A lot had happened, and he had to hide his identity as a monster, and for that reason, they came there, seeking help and answers. The girl then takes a deep breath and says she understood. However, unfortunately, the fire deity wasn't there. Park Han-yu in turn is surprised by what the young woman had said. Anju feels awkward and says that he had already left Appraisal, but he had always been attentive to his family, so if they brought him a gift, he would make his flute. Next, Park Han-yu wonders why Wanak made them come all the way there if the fire deity had been gone for a long time. The girl then says that the boy must have noticed by now, and that makes him curious. Anju responds that her brother must have brought them there hoping that they would accept the boy into Appraisal, and to be more direct, perhaps he wants the protagonist to take the throne, which will soon be vacant there. On a flying base, Deok and Yua are sitting in silence, and the young woman then asks what the boy was thinking, and he in turn responds that it was nothing. The woman asks if he wasn't enjoying the fact that he was participating in that meeting, because he had said he wanted to be at the forefront of the subjugation of the East Sea. Deok explains that since the Dragon King of the Sea had attacked them, causing them to lose the seven-branched sword, they had started to suffer a lot of damage. Furthermore, many innocent people ended up dying because of what they did, so they couldn't forgive them, and no matter what happens, they would make him pay one way or another. Yua tells him not to come up with such crazy ideas, because the sea creatures were now their enemies and must be eliminated without leaving a single one alive. And if the boy said that again, she would remove him from leadership. Deok in turn decides to obey the orders. Next, the young woman thinks about how, during the meeting, everyone had agreed on the subjugation, and that a new dragon would have to take the throne that would be vacant after they subdued the entire East Sea. Depending on the new dragon that assumes this role, his power could have consequences they couldn't even imagine. But the good news is that there weren't many dragons, so not just anyone could ascend to the throne, and they also couldn't let anyone take advantage of that. They needed a new child for that position, a dragon that would remain in the palm of their hands. Park Han-yul asks An-myo for help in hiding the fact that he was a dragon and letting him leave a saddle in peace. The young woman says that assuming the Dragon King's throne would be the easiest way for him to have peace. The protagonist in turn responds that even then, they would still treat him like a dog, and what he most hated was living as a puppet in the hands of someone powerful. He then lowers his head, saying that if possible, he would like to receive some advice about his future actions. Unlike others, he never had the chance to meet many people he could truly trust. An-myo says that in that way, it even makes her feel pity for him and his brother. Park Han-yul lifts his head, asking what she was talking about. The young woman then says that she won't let her brother leave again, because a long time ago when her brother left Appraisal, she tried to stop him in every possible way, and that she knew he had taken on the responsibility of caring for Mount Wanak, but it was a shame to have left everything behind becoming a miserable being. Park Han-yul in turn says that he could sell his freedom to pay that price, but the young woman refuses the proposal. An-myo mentions that to sit on the Eastern Throne, his core needed to be filled with water energy. Let the sea itself, otherwise there wouldn't be the thrones they had. Besides, the boy seemed weak, but there was something she could give him to help, because thanks to her connection with one of the Dragon Kings, she had the location of a place that would benefit him, so she would give it to him. With that, he could enhance the energy in his core and become stronger while synchronizing with the water. Park Han-yul thinks that he needed to leave before Wanak woke up, but even so, he would still like to at least say goodbye to him. Next, the boy tells the young woman that he would never forget what she was doing for him. 3 days later, the protagonist is surprised by what he sees, as he had arrived at the throne of Mount Baektu, and had never felt an energy like that before. While observing the water, he wonders if that meant there were cores inside that lake. He then decides to dive into the waters. Noticing that he could still breathe, he felt his body lighter there, as if he were a fish. Upon reaching the bottom of the lake, he encounters something shining, and the boy thinks that must be what he was looking for. Soon after, he realizes that just by being near it, he could feel the water energy accumulating, deciding to get closer, thinking that perhaps he would become stronger. However, the young man realizes that it was more difficult than he thought. Then an explosion of energy occurs, but it doesn't affect the boy, who in turn feels different, as if his power was balancing inside him. However, his thoughts are interrupted when he senses an energy approaching. He then remembers that An Mio had told him that when he removed the seal, those who felt that energy would appear, and that perhaps the boy would face difficulties as they were beings more synchronized with the water. Park Han-yeol says they arrived too quickly. Upon returning to the surface, he encounters an enormous creature. The protagonist in turn says that he won't give up so easily, and then decides to strike the creature. However, that monster easily blocks the boy's attack. Shortly after, the boy is hit by lightning. A second serpent appears, questioning how a creature like him could carry the energy of a dragon when he couldn't even control it. The creature then responds that if they ate the boy, they would be able to evolve as well. However, the monsters notice that where the protagonist had fallen, there were peach blossoms. Park Han-yeol was still standing. The serpent smiles and says that it was surprising, as it seemed he was preparing his own funeral with those flowers. However, when attempting to attack him again, a peach tree grows and ends up attracting the lightning to it. The protagonist smiles, seeing that his plan had worked. The serpents are shocked by what they just witnessed. Park Han-yeol then asks if the creature still believed that the funeral was his. Noticing that his brother was irritated, the serpent says she would handle the situation, then unleashing her attacks made of crystals. However, they are destroyed in midair as the protagonist had used his scroll to stop them. That creature thinks it would be better to leave before things got worse, but before she could say anything, she realizes that her brother had already flowed. Realizing that the battle was over, the boy releases his scroll and begins coughing, as he had used too much of his power without thinking, and he couldn't afford to lose there, because if he lost, he would never get another opportunity like that. The serpents continue to flee, but the protagonist appears in front of them, making the creatures wonder how he had gotten there. Surprised, the creature asks how Park had arrived at that place, asking who that pest was, mentioning that he was very annoying and that she wouldn't let him get any closer. Next, Park seems to start charging an attack, and the creature can't believe what she's seeing, and soon after, she seems to start running away from the boy. With a piercing look, Park asks her to come back, managing to strike the creature. In disbelief, the snake wonders how he was doing that, apologizing to her brother, as if she stayed in that place, she might end up dying. That's why she decided to leave quickly, assuming that she had finally thought she would become a dragon and have the power of a... At that moment, Park was beside the creature, asking where she thought she was going. The plant that Park used to take down the two serpents was called Black Garden Bamboo, one of the most sacred plants in the garden, which had been enhanced for battle since ancient times, and was used to take down two ocean serpents trapped with the spirit of the fox. While trapped, the creature begs her brother for help, and Park, at that moment, seems surprised by what he is seeing, wondering what kind of place that was, supposing that it might be some kind of palace, thinking that it must have appeared to him now that he owned the core, so it was better to take a look at it. Shortly after, the snake starts laughing, mentioning that she wouldn't do anything, begging to have the Black Garden Bamboo removed, because it was hurting too much and she didn't want to die that way. Accepting the creature's offer, Park says that if she tried anything, he would blow her head off, ordering her not to lie to the boy, asking if there were other ocean serpents like her there, to which she quickly replies that they came to that place when the barrier opened, so there should be 4 more serpents around. Park questions how they knew that the barrier had been opened, and the snake responds that they were connected to that place. She, along with her brother, were servants there, and that's why they still had a master. However, 6,000 years ago, their master passed away, so they trained all that time to take his place. Park, in turn, thinks that this could be very useful to him, saying he would remove all the Black Garden Bamboo from her if she could guide into the palace. The serpent then asks if they would be free because it was a bit uncomfortable to remain in that form. Next, the creature transforms into a beautiful woman and introduces herself as Herrick. The protagonist, in turn, says they should continue. The girl is back with a sad expression, lamenting that she and her brother ended up like this, but was happy they were still alive. Inside the palace, a stand before an enormous door. Herrick explains to the boy that everything within the structure moved according to the core, and it could be used freely by the water bearer. Since her former master died, that place became a sacred site, so anyone unworthy wouldn't be able to enter and open the barrier. Park thinks the strangest thing was that outside there was water with floating fish, mentioning that in that place, he could make a garden outside. Meanwhile, the two continue to walk. Then the serpent informs him that this was the Dragon Palace's vault, and only the core bearer would be able to open it, and all the treasures her master possessed were in that place. Next, the protagonist seems to be casting a spell, saying they should take a better look at it. Shortly after, he manages to open the place. Looking around, he notices that it was very clean. However, he is surprised by what he sees as a giant bookshelf stands before him. Observing its contents, he mentions that those books didn't seem like anything special. Starting to read one of them, he realizes it was a martial arts book. Then the serpent, now in human form, informs him that those with the celestial techniques of the dragon and her master had practiced all of them. Park, in turn, asks what she and her brother had trained in all that time to be able to claim that place. The serpent explains that most of them had sought a master capable of guiding them, but in her case, she and her brother hadn't had a master since theirs had passed away. Since then, they had been making do with what they had. Park thinks that must be the reason why the serpent so strongly desired to return to that place, and if he were to take seriously what she had said, they might end up evolving into dragons if they learn to use their techniques correctly. Understanding the situation, Park allows them to use the books. However, for that to happen, they would have to become his subordinates, to which the serpent quickly responds that she would do so with great pleasure. Handing a book to the creature, the boy says that would be her first task, asking her to be ready to receive visitors. Thinking that they would do well in her human form, he wonders if all ocean creatures were like that. He also wanted to know what her brother's human form was like. Sometime later, a man seems to be sitting at a table drinking. The protagonist then thinks that he never imagined a deity like that would meet with him personally. Even though he was only a pure immortal, he was still receiving due attention because of his draconic energy, which meant that Yuo would respect him in the same way. Shortly after, the man starts speaking, asking why he was seeing him so soon after arriving at his palace. The boy then seems to take out a type of bamboo, mentioning that he needed a favor from him. Observing the object, the man realizes it is a black jade sprout bamboo. Park in turn says that he wishes for him to use it to make a flute of peace. Hearing what the young man said, the man replies that he was quite a greedy young man. However, the boy insists that he didn't want to do anything bad. The man, in turn, says that he didn't need to explain his reason, but he should relax more after all. His job was to make his items. Observing the object, he mentions that should be enough to make a fine flute, and for that reason, he would try his best. Park, in turn, thinks that he had been quick in his analysis, which meant he was an excellent craftsman. Next, the protagonist mentions that there was something else he wanted. At that moment, he seems to start removing something from one of his spells, and as a result, a sword appears. The protagonist thinks that he had found that sword in the ancient Dragon King's vault. The moment he touches it, a terrifying aura begins to take over the protagonist, saying that the energy was strange and couldn't be compared to rage. It made him feel bloodthirsty, as if he were anxious to kill someone like an assassin. Observing the situation, Park thinks that this was a problem because it seemed useful, but even so, he wasn't able to wield it properly. While looking at the sword, the man says it seemed to have something unusual about it. Next, the man attempts to pick up the sword. Park quickly asks him to wait, as it was completely different from conventional swords. However, the man easily manages to hold the sword, leaving Park completely shocked by what he saw, as he had barely been able to control the sword with his power, assuming that was the power of the greatest craftsman in the world, the one who held the title of the fire deity. Then the man informs him that the sword possessed an evil energy created by the dwarves of the north. Its strength was incredible, but it held a terrible energy that could destroy whoever used it. However, that could be fixed by making a new scabbard, and if he had a scabbard that could control it, it would seal its energy, allowing him to use it only when he drew the sword. However, he should remember one thing, because even if he managed to use it, it wouldn't leave him alone until it had his blood on its blade. Park, understanding the situation, says he would keep that in mind. Then the man informs Park that he would return once he finished making his flute and scabbard. Meanwhile, the protagonist seems to be analyzing something, saying that it was incredible, and he never thought there would be such good things in that place. He had much to learn, especially since the bear was not around, and knowledge was never too much. At that moment, the serpent, still in her human form, seems to call the protagonist, mentioning that a visitor had just arrived. Sometime later, an older man asks if he was the new king of the palace, introducing himself as Taebek from the Immortal's sacred temple. In that temple, during a certain dynasty, there was a man who lived on a mountain between the 8 provinces of Jojen, who consecrated the deities of the country and performed rituals for them. However, the truth of that story was different, as there were actually 8 mountains, each with powerful immortals. Thus, the palace decreed that the mountain should return to its sacred life. dedicated to the deities as if it were a temple. Then years later, the place was abolished, and now the door to heaven had reopened, and the government of the Korean Republic allowed the immortals to once again use that sacred ground. And the man standing in front of the protagonist was the one who commanded that place, or better yet, known as the current owner of the mountain. Park, in turn, says that it was a pleasure to meet him, and he should have come to greet him sooner. However, the man dismisses this, saying that he was merely passing by and decided to visit, mentioning that he had also brought along a disciple. The girl introducing herself says that she was the elder's youngest disciple, and her name was Shin. Thus, it was a pleasure to meet him. Observing the girl, the protagonist seems surprised, saying they should sit in a room and asking them to follow him. Sometime later, the three of them seem to be walking. Meanwhile, Park thinks that the girl had changed quite a bit, as it seemed she had become the disciple of that priest. But in any case, the visit was very strange, and he wondered what the priest might want. Soon, the priest begins to speak, questioning the protagonist's relationship with the normal bears. The boy explains that they were very difficult beings, and at the same time, owned many things between heaven and earth. But in truth, he owed a lot to them and only became friends with one of them because he had maintained a close relationship. The priest comments that Park hadn't even reached 100 years of age and was already ranked as a pure immortal, and yet he already had a palace. He had seen few young people like him achieve so much so quickly. Introducing his disciple, he mentions that she was also young, had excellent skills, and was almost reaching the celestial immortal level. For that reason, he proposed a wager, asking what the boy thought about training his disciple. The protagonist, in turn, asks if he meant that they should train together. The man responds affirmatively, saying that he thought they would be pleased to train against each other, and who knows, that girl might even end up becoming his wife, leaving Park completely shocked by what he had just heard. Then the man informs him that this was the reason why they should begin training together. As the man speaks, the girl doesn't seem at all happy with the idea. Park then apologizes, saying that he wasn't interested in that kind of relationship. Immediately afterward, the man advises him to make quick decisions, as it would greatly help in his training. Moreover, if that relationship happened, it would make Park his son-in-law. And for that reason, he wasn't the type of person who treated his son-in-law badly, placing a kind of jar on the table. Park, in turn, seems surprised by its contents, thinking that it could hide the fact that he had an irregular physique because of it. Thus, he had never seen medicine the same way since then. Observing the jar, he mentions that it was rare and extremely valuable. Then Park informs the man that he had already promised to marry someone. The man, in turn, comments that he was quite resistant, but that there was no way for two people bound by physical attraction to be just something else. Asking what was wrong with having more than one wife, and why Park was treating himself as if he were a common person. As he observes the girl, he notices that she doesn't seem happy with the situation, and shortly after, Park seems to accept the proposal. While feeling bad for the girl, he mentions that he would accept her as his student and marry her. Thus, a few days pass, and the protagonists seem to be training. Shortly afterward, a kind of blue cloud begins to form between his fingers. Feeling pleased that he had managed to do it, he mentions that it was extremely beautiful, thinking that now that he knew the principles, he could make it rain if he used more energy. And if a celestial demon god's art reached 6 stars, he could combine different properties to cause a natural disaster. That was very interesting to him because he wanted to reach 6 stars as soon as possible. Shortly after, the serpent still in her human form seems to call the protagonist, mentioning that the young lady wanted to eat in her room, so Park thinks it's time to use Tybeck's mortal, telling her to come in. Meanwhile, the young woman seems to be at the protagonist's door, thinking that since ancient times, it has been a shocking and strange fate to be with a dragon or even to enter a family of one. Even though she was reluctant, she thought all this was happening because of her master. Shortly after, the girl opens the door, apologizing for the intrusion. Meanwhile, the protagonist seems to be lying down, asking if the girl had arrived. He mentions that he had decorated the place in a way mortals liked, asking what she thought of it. Feeling somewhat embarrassed, the girl thanks him for the consideration. At that moment, Park asks if she didn't want to do this, because looking at her expression, she didn't seem very happy, and it was ridiculous for a woman to pretend she was on equal footing with him, and that was putting it lightly. So he asked if she thought he wouldn't know she was using or offering that treasure, because her master had offered it along with that, questioning how she earned the title of Celestial of Beck. Hearing what the boy said, the girl becomes completely enraged. Drawing her sword, she says that if he insulted her master one more time, she wouldn't forget it. At that moment, the protagonist summons one of his spirits, saying that this was becoming more interesting as a mere human was insulting him. He states that he is the king and this is his palace, and no matter how much one flew or crawled in his direction, there is nothing a mere celestial immortal could do. Observing the situation from the ground, the girl remains silent. Shortly after, the protagonist asks her to follow him, as he had a better alternative to solve everything. Then he seems to take out some kind of object, asking her to eat it. Observing what the protagonist was offering, the girl wonders what it could be. As she takes the item, the girl thinks it might be a life pill to preserve the 8 treasures, thinking that it was a basic pill, but she didn't really need it right now. However, judging by his skills in making medicines, this creation might be different from the ones she had consumed before. Starting to eat it, she thinks there was nothing wrong with it, so she might as well try it once. At that moment, the girl is surprised by the effect, as it was definitely a well-made medicine, leaving no aroma or taste, supposing she had never had this feeling with her master's medicines before. Moreover, the internal injuries she had suffered before were completely healed, and her strength was increasing. The girl then asks what kind of technique the protagonist had used. Park responds that it's just a matter of having quality ingredients and excellent skills, and his were quite special, so the girl should be happy. For that reason, her master seemed to be a rather difficult opponent to ignore, and it seemed he didn't intend to use the art of unlocking this scepter on her. Asking what the girl thought about them being husband and wife outwardly, the girl asks if really thought her master wouldn't find out everything, and the protagonist asks if her master had no thoughts of consuming the medicines he made. At that moment, the young woman seems surprised, realizing what was happening. Then Park responds that he would continue refining medicines for her, and for that reason, she should provide the blue void eye. The girl in turn thinks that, considering the pill that increased her strength before, of course she had no doubts about it. Accepting the offer, the girl mentions that he should promise one thing at least. Since the blue eye was a precious ingredient, he should inform her when he intended to use it. Then Park says that if it ever got to the point where she thought he was using it inappropriately, she would always cry and go to her master. Shortly after, the girl asks what he was going to do with it. Park responds that with that item, he would make a kind of liquor, leaving the girl completely surprised by what she heard, wondering if she really should have handed that item to the boy. Sometime later, the protagonist already seems to be drinking the item, thinking that the effectiveness of his medicine had slightly decreased, and its effects now worked faster and lasted longer, in addition to being much more effective. With this, he had practiced enough, so he should start taking it, creating something with the blue eye. Shortly after, the girl from before appears again, apparently drunk for some reason, beginning to say all sorts of confusing things to the protagonist, asking him to give her something else, as he had promised it to her. No longer able to tolerate the situation, Park asks if his subordinate could take care of her, leaving the drunken girl completely irritated, asking if he didn't know that he couldn't just ignore people, mentioning that her father was a high-ranking firefighter who had received a presidential honor, and besides, he was an old man, sneaking out, thinking no one would know about it. Hearing what the girl said, Park seemed surprised, thinking that he had unexpectedly stumbled upon something interesting. For that reason, he should think of a way to gradually make use of this information, but before that, he should use that item properly first. A few days later, the protagonist seems to be in a part of his forest, thinking that the place was good, and considering that the ingredients were so great, their aroma was strong, and it could be problematic if the immortals of Seoul noticed what he was doing. Then, shortly after, he uncorks the jar containing the contents, and a glow begins to emanate from it. Park, in turn, thinks that the smell alone was enough to make him feel intoxicated. This drink contained the essence of immortality peaches, and using bee carcasses as fertilizer had made them grow larger and more flavorful. Next, the protagonist seems to pour some into his cup, thinking that it could indeed drive someone crazy. Then, someone seems to be behind him, and he quickly puts on his mask, thinking it might be an immortal, as he hadn't sensed the presence. The mysterious man tells him not to be so cautious, as he was just someone who really enjoyed a good drink. Observing the man, the protagonist seems to recognize him. The elder then asks if he wouldn't mind sharing his sip, mentioning that the aroma was hard to resist. Park kindly offers him some, leaving the man completely delighted with what he had received, mentioning that the young man was very generous, and for that reason he wouldn't refuse. And shortly after, he begins drinking the liquor, mentioning that it was truly the best drink he had ever consumed, and that he hadn't seen such a type of liquor in a long time. Park, in turn, says that the man had once said that if he died, he could forever forget the taste of the liquor, mentioning that his junior, whom he had introduced, was late. Originally, a man who loved to travel had fallen in love with the taste of palace liquor and settled in the northern mountain territory. Being one of the 8 Chinese immortals, he had slain numerous dragons and conquered evil with the technique of celestial evasion sword, his name being Dongbai. For this reason, he should greet the new ruler of the heavens and earth of the immortal sword. However, the man informs Park that since his agreement with that young man had been dissolved, he would now consider the protagonist as his brother, asking if the protagonist knew about this. Park, in turn, asks if he wasn't breaking any rules by being a Dragon King. The elder admits it was awkward, but at first he didn't know that Park was a new Dragon King, which is why he had the idea of calling him brother. Park, in turn, says that he should know how precious that liquor was judging by its aroma, something so graceful it could be the work of a genius or a kind of judgment. At that moment, the elder asks the young man to stop talking, mentioning that he was embarrassed to have said he drank a lot, and besides, he couldn't bear hearing those irritating words any longer. Thinking that although it was an agreement created for agricultural purposes, he should decide whether to be rigid or fair. Park, in turn, comments that he thought his superiors would reprimand him if they heard the man calling him by a higher title. For that reason, they should take some of the liquor and go together to his ancestral sanctuary. The elder responds that if that's how things were, nothing could be better. Thanking the young man for saving his life, he adds that if Park ever needed help, he should feel free to call him at any time. At that moment, Park asks if he could request a favor. The Celestial Evasion Sword technique was a legendary sword spell, with the assistance of an enigmatic immortal named Long, who had achieved immense passion for slaying a mnemonic dragon. Although he had only used a single sword, it was an enigmatic technique different from martial arts that everyone used as their own power, much like the techniques used by those who relied on their human physiques to spread, and they both had earthly bodies and wielded swords. Right after, Park asks the man to teach him the technique of his sword. For that reason, there would be no harm in learning it. 2 days pass after leaving the demon's abode, and in the meantime, a giant creature seemed to be crawling through that place. Inside a small house, a boy looks at his younger brother and gently says, "Everything will be okay. Time will heal us." But before the words can settle, a terrifying creature appears right in front of them. The older brother, trying to protect the younger one, charges toward it, but then pulls his brother into a tight embrace, tears running down his face. Suddenly, Park arrives on the scene. He casually remarks that the area seems to have some great fertilizer, and without hesitation, launches a powerful strike at the monster, instantly taking it down. The boy watches in disbelief. He's alive. Someone actually survived? Park smirks and says that he just earned even more fertilizer from the kill. But then, he notices something that catches him completely off guard. 2 children hiding nearby. Putting the pieces together, he realizes the horrifying truth. These kids were offered as sacrifices. His eyes narrow, rage boiling beneath the surface. At that exact moment, the creature gets back up. It growls, charging straight toward Park, vowing to finish him first. But before it even gets close, boom! An explosion rips through the space, and the demon is obliterated in seconds. The boy, watching from the shadows, had already accepted death. He thought there was no one left to save them, but now, his eyes widen. There stands Park, towering over the shattered remains of the beast. The creature, in shock, stares up at him. I devoured you! How are you still alive? Park doesn't respond with words. He simply raises his blade and begins slicing the demon apart, one cut after another. "This won't happen again," he mutters coldly. Then he vanishes. In a blink, Park appears high above the monster, activating his special ability. He rains down another brutal wave of cuts, finishing it off once and for all. But instead of celebrating, Park looks annoyed. The celestial evasion technique is still frustratingly hard for him to master. He sighs, thinking back. He never expected his senior to train him by literally throwing him off a cliff. But somehow it worked. And with all the monsters grouped in this area, it turned into the perfect training ground. Moments later, the boy steps forward, full of gratitude. "Thank you," he says quietly. Park turns to him and asks, "You too, are you from the immortal realm?" The boy nods. He explains that while he didn't inherit any special powers, his family speaks an ancient shamanic language. Then, voices echo in the distance. A group of people appears, demanding to know who's there. But before they can act, a spirit linked to the protagonist launches an attack. Park watches silently by his side, emotionless, reflecting on what the boy had told him earlier. His mother, she was a shaman. When the monsters came, the people in her city turned against her family, offering them as sacrifices. After his uncle was devoured, his mother tried to resist, forging iron to defend them. But the soldiers found out, and they killed her mercilessly. Park clenches his jaw. She tried to save her village, and they betrayed her. He walks over to the boy, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't cry," he says softly. "I'll make sure they pay. I'll avenge your family." Back in the present, the boy launches a flurry of strikes alongside his spirit, attacking a building with intense precision. He casually notes how his spirit has been acting a lot more loyal lately, probably because it finally recognized the huge gap in power now that Park had become a dragon. And weirdly enough, the spirit had grown surprisingly friendly with the bear too, more than he ever expected. Suddenly, the spirit returns, holding a man in its mouth. Park eyes the figure and mutters, "At first, I thought you were some kind of fairy, maybe even an immortal. But no, turned out this was nothing but a monster, wearing a human body like a disguise. And worse, they were all a bunch of fools." That's when a furious voice interrupts. A wolf, glaring at Park, demands, "Who do you think you are, barging into the mind of our spirit faction?" Park responds without flinching. He didn't come for games. He came for payback, for the innocent lives they had taken. The man recoils, hesitant. "You in that much of a rush to die?" Cut to later, Park, flying across the skies with his spirit, heading straight for enemy territory. The destination? A cursed land, North Korea. A wasteland where lost supernatural beings from China and South Korea had gathered. There they formed the Spirit Faction, now ruled by none other than Mr. Tenga, the White Tiger, an 8th-class divine being who had slumbered for over 1,000 years. As Park flies over the area, he sees a chilling sight. Below, some kind of battle is underway, corpses scattered across the ground, and animals feasting on them. So they weren't just pretending to be human anymore, they'd completely abandoned the act, now resorting to cannibalism. Disgusted, Park begins casting a spell. "These things are foul," he mutters, then summons a spinning tornado that blasts toward the creatures. They barely have time to react. One of them looks up in disbelief, frozen in place by the incoming storm. Park then turns to the wolf, who's now begging not to be thrown in. But Park doesn't hesitate. Without an ounce of mercy, he tosses the wolf straight into the tornado. He watches silently, expression cold, when suddenly, an explosion erupts. In the chaos, someone from the battlefield looks up, panicked. "What's going on? Someone powerful is attacking us!" Meanwhile, Park notices something odd. The wolf had escaped the tornado way too easily. Now airborne again, the wolf scowls, shocked that someone like Park, who looked so ordinary, had dared to speak to him like an equal. But enough talking. He growls out an order for his subordinates to attack. Yet, before they can even move, boom! A lightning bolt crashes down, frying one of them instantly. The wolf turns around, only to see that all of his men have been taken out in seconds. Before he can even process what's happening, 2 enormous serpents rise up in front of him. Park calmly calls out, "They must be hungry," then adds, "Let's wrap this up quickly. I don't have all night." If you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic manhwa recaps. See you in the next one.